Close your eyes and imagine a world map that never existed. A world where the monsoon winds that blessed the Indian subcontinent carried more than just rain and trade goods. They carried armies, ideas, and an empire that stretched from the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas to the coral atolls of Southeast Asia. Picture ancient India not as a collection of warring kingdoms, but as a unified colossus that looked eastward across the Bay of Bengal and saw not distant lands, but future provinces of a grand Asian empire. What if the Mauryans had never fallen? What if Ashoka's descendants had turned their gaze beyond the traditional boundaries of the subcontinent and dreamed of something unprecedented in human history? Tonight, we embark on a journey through time to explore one of history's greatest what-ifs. A scenario where ancient India, unified under a single banner, set its sights on conquering not just neighboring lands, but the entire Asian continent. Welcome to History for Sleep, where we drift through the corridors of time to explore the paths not taken. I'm your guide through these twilight hours, and tonight, we're going to unravel a tale that would have reshaped the very foundations of civilization as we know it. As you settle into your pillow and let the gentle rhythm of my voice carry you towards slumber, we'll explore how a unified ancient India might have created the largest empire the world had ever seen, centuries before the rise of Rome or the Mongol hordes. The stage for our alternate history begins in the 3rd century BCE, during the reign of Ashoka the Great. In our timeline, Ashoka's empire stretched across most of the Indian subcontinent, from present-day Afghanistan to Bangladesh, from Kashmir to Karnataka. It was already the largest empire in Indian history, encompassing roughly 5 million square kilometers and ruling over an estimated 50 million people. But what if Ashoka's vision had been even grander? What if the horrors of the Kalinga War, instead of converting him to Buddhism and pacifism, had instead convinced him that only through absolute dominion over all of Asia could lasting peace be achieved? Picture this alternative Ashoka, standing on the blood-soaked fields of Kalinga, not filled with remorse, but with terrible clarity. The suffering he witnessed would not be ended through non-violence and moral suasion, but through the establishment of a universal empire that would eliminate war by eliminating borders. In this timeline, Ashoka becomes not the Buddhist emperor of peace, but the Alexander of the East, driven by a divine mandate to bring all of Asia under the umbrella of Indian civilization. Our alternate history begins with Ashoka's decision to maintain and expand his war machine rather than disbanding it. The Mauryan military, already the most sophisticated in the known world, continues to grow. Ashoka's famed espionage network, which in our timeline spread Buddhist teachings, instead becomes a vast intelligence apparatus, gathering information about the kingdoms beyond India's borders. From the Greek kingdoms of Bactria and Sogdiana to the nascent Han dynasty in China, from the tribal confederations of Southeast Asia to the emerging kingdoms of the Korean peninsula, Ashoka's spies map not just geography, but political weaknesses, military capabilities, and economic resources. The transformation begins at home. Instead of carving edicts about dharma into rocks across his empire, this alternate Ashoka commissions detailed surveys of his realm's resources. Every mine, every fertile valley, every navigable river is catalogued and optimized for war production. The famous Mauryan iron industry, already advanced for its time, receives massive investment. New techniques for steel production are developed, creating weapons and armor superior to anything possessed by India's potential enemies. But technology alone would not be enough for Ashoka's grand vision. The key to unifying Asia would lie in understanding and exploiting the unique advantages that ancient India possessed. First among these was India's position as the crossroads of ancient trade networks. The subcontinent sat at the center of maritime routes connecting the Mediterranean with Southeast Asia and China, while overland routes linked India to Central Asia and the Silk Road. This geographic advantage had already made Indian merchants wealthy and Indian culture influential from Java to Samarkand. In our alternate timeline, Ashoka recognizes that economic dominance must precede military conquest. Rather than simply taxing trade, the Mauryan state begins to actively direct it. Indian merchants, backed by state resources and protected by Mauryan naval forces, establish not just trading posts, but fortified colonies throughout the Indian Ocean. The Malabar and Coromandel coasts become launching points for expeditions that establish permanent Indian settlements in Ceylon, the Maldives, and eventually the great island of Java. These early expansions serve multiple purposes. They provide forward bases for future military operations. They spread Indian cultural and administrative practices, and they create networks of loyalty that will prove crucial in the centuries to come. Most importantly, they generate enormous wealth that flows back to the Mauryan heartland, funding the military buildup that will make continental conquest possible. The cultural dimension of this expansion cannot be underestimated. In our timeline, Indian religions, art, architecture, and administrative practices spread throughout Southeast Asia through peaceful cultural diffusion. Imagine instead a deliberate policy of cultural imperialism backed by state power. Ashoka's alternate empire doesn't just trade with foreign lands, it systematically exports Indian civilization. Sanskrit becomes not just a liturgical language but the administrative tongue of an expanding empire. Indian legal codes, refined and standardized, become the foundation of governance across a dozen kingdoms. Hindu and Buddhist temples, built with Mauryan funding and expertise, become centers not just of worship, but of Indian cultural influence. This cultural preparation paves the way for political absorption. Local rulers, already adopting Indian customs and dependent on Indian trade, find themselves increasingly integrated into the Mauryan system. When Ashoka's armies finally arrive, they come not as foreign conquerors, but as the military arm of a civilization that has already taken root. The first major expansion beyond the traditional boundaries of India targets Ceylon, the great island that would later be known as Sri Lanka. In our timeline, Ceylon maintained its independence for centuries, though it was heavily influenced by Indian culture and Buddhism. In our alternate history, Ashoka's naval forces, launched from ports along the Tamil coast, make Ceylon the first overseas province of the expanding Mauryan Empire. The conquest of Ceylon serves as a template for future expansions. Ashoka's forces don't simply occupy territory, they transform it. The island's existing irrigation systems are expanded and improved using Mauryan engineering techniques. New cities are founded according to Indian urban planning principles. The local population is integrated into the Mauryan administrative system, with the local elites granted positions within the imperial hierarchy in exchange for loyalty. More importantly, Ceylon becomes a naval base for further expansion into Southeast Asia. Mauryan shipbuilders, working with local craftsmen familiar with monsoon navigation, develop new classes of vessels capable of carrying large armies across the Bay of Bengal. These ships, larger and more sophisticated than anything previously seen in the Indian Ocean, give the Mauryan Empire a naval supremacy that will prove decisive in the conquests to come. The success in Ceylon emboldens Ashoka to look further eastward. The kingdoms of Southeast Asia, from the Mon and Khmer peoples of the mainland to the various principalities of the Indonesian archipelago, suddenly find themselves facing a unified Indian empire with both the will and the capability to project power across vast oceanic distances. But Ashoka's vision extends beyond maritime expansion. To the north and west, the fragmented Greek kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's conquests present both an opportunity and a threat. These Hellenistic states, perpetually at war with each other and increasingly isolated from the Mediterranean world, possess military technologies and administrative practices that could enhance Mauryan power. More importantly, their control of Central Asian trade routes makes them strategic targets for an empire seeking to dominate all of Asia. The alternate Ashoka begins his northern campaign not with direct military assault, but with a combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and strategic alliance building. Mauryan gold, flowing freely from the empire's expanded trade networks, finds its way into the treasuries of Greek generals and local chieftains. Indian merchants, backed by state power, gradually monopolize the trade routes that these kingdoms depend upon for survival. When military action finally comes, it is swift and decisive. The Mauryan army, now expanded and equipped with the finest iron weapons in the world, crosses the Hindu Kush not as invaders but as liberators, welcomed by populations weary of constant warfare between petty Greek tyrants. One by one, the Hellenistic kingdoms of Bactria, Sogdiana, and Margiana fall to Mauryan arms or submit voluntarily to join the growing empire. These conquests bring more than territory. They bring knowledge. Greek mathematical and astronomical texts are translated into Sanskrit and incorporated into Indian learning. Hellenistic military techniques, particularly in siege warfare and cavalry tactics, are adapted and improved by Mauryan commanders. Most importantly, the Greeks' experience in governing diverse populations across vast distances provides valuable lessons for administering an empire that now stretches from the Arabian Sea to the Oxus River. With the northwest secured, Ashoka turns his attention to the greatest prize of all, China. The Han dynasty, established just decades after the founding of the Mauryan Empire, rules over a civilization as ancient and sophisticated as India's own. But the Han emperors face their own challenges. Nomadic invasions from the north, rebellions in the south, and the enormous cost of maintaining their own expanding empire. In our alternate timeline, the Mauryan Empire approaches China not as a direct military threat, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign of infiltration and alliance building. Indian merchants, following ancient trade routes through Central Asia, establish permanent communities in Chinese border cities. Buddhist monks, traveling alongside these merchants, begin to spread their teachings among Chinese intellectuals and officials. The key to Mauryan success in China lies in understanding and exploiting the cyclical nature of Chinese political history. The Han dynasty, like all Chinese dynasties, faces the constant challenge of the mandate of heaven. Natural disasters, military defeats, or social unrest can be interpreted as signs that the dynasty has lost divine favor and should be replaced. Ashoka's agents, working through their networks of merchants and monks, begin to cultivate relationships with Chinese officials, generals, and intellectuals who might be receptive to the idea of joining a larger, more stable empire. They offer not conquest, but partnership. China would retain its cultural distinctiveness and administrative autonomy while gaining access to Indian Ocean trade networks and protection from nomadic invasions. The process is gradual, taking place over decades rather than years. Indian influence in China grows slowly but steadily, manifested in everything from architectural styles to philosophical debates. When the crucial moment arrives, perhaps triggered by a succession crisis or a major military defeat, the Mauryan Empire is positioned to present itself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a natural ally and eventual partner in a greater Asian confederation. This patient approach to Chinese expansion reflects a broader evolution in Mauryan imperial strategy. As the empire grows larger and more diverse, direct military conquest becomes increasingly impractical. Instead, Ashoka and his successors develop what we might call a hegemonic model of empire, where local rulers maintain nominal independence while acknowledging Mauryan supremacy and participating in empire-wide economic and cultural systems. This model proves particularly effective in Southeast Asia, where the complex geography of islands, peninsulas, and river deltas makes direct administration challenging. Rather than attempting to govern every village and port directly, the Mauryan Empire establishes a network of client kingdoms and tributary states. Local rulers who acknowledge Mauryan supremacy and pay tribute are left in place, while those who resist face the full might of the imperial military machine. The cultural implications of this hegemonic approach are profound. Unlike empires that impose uniformity on their subjects, the Mauryan Empire becomes a cosmopolitan confederation that celebrates diversity while maintaining unity. Sanskrit serves as a common administrative language, but local languages flourish. Hindu and Buddhist traditions spread throughout the empire, but they adapt to local customs and beliefs rather than replacing them entirely. This cultural flexibility becomes one of the empire's greatest strengths. Local populations don't feel oppressed by foreign rule because they see their own traditions reflected in the broader imperial culture. Local elites don't rebel against imperial authority because they profit from participation in empire-wide trade and administrative networks. The result is a stability that allows the empire to continue expanding, even as it grows to unprecedented size. By the end of Ashoka's reign in this alternate timeline, the Mauryan Empire encompasses not just the Indian subcontinent, but Ceylon, much of Southeast Asia, and significant portions of Central Asia. Chinese influence grows steadily, while the foundations are laid for future expansion into Korea, Japan, and the islands of the Pacific. The empire's population approaches 100 million people, making it by far the largest political entity in human history up to that point. But size alone does not guarantee success. As we'll explore in the next part of our journey, maintaining unity across such vast distances and diverse populations would present challenges that would test the very foundations of Indian civilization. The question that haunts our alternate history is whether any empire, no matter how well designed or culturally flexible, could truly unify all of Asia under a single banner. The administrative innovations required to govern such an empire would need to be unprecedented in their scope and sophistication. The economic systems necessary to maintain prosperity across dozens of different climates and cultures would require a level of planning and coordination that would challenge even modern states. And the military forces needed to defend such vast frontiers would consume resources on a scale that might ultimately prove unsustainable. As Ashoka's reign draws to a close in our alternate timeline, the great emperor faces the eternal question that confronts all empire builders: how to ensure that what has been built will survive those who built it. The answer to that question would shape not just the fate of India, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. In our alternate timeline, as Ashoka approaches his final years, he becomes consumed with a problem that no conqueror before him had ever faced on such a scale. How do you pass on an empire that spans from the Caspian Sea to the Java Sea? How do you ensure that a political entity encompassing dozens of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, and thousands of distinct communities doesn't fragment the moment its founder draws his last breath? Ashoka's solution would prove to be as revolutionary as his conquests. Rather than following the traditional pattern of dividing the empire among his sons, he creates something entirely new in human history: a constitutional monarchy bound together by written law and institutional continuity. The Mauryan Code, as it comes to be known, establishes not just the rules of succession, but a comprehensive framework for governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that stretches across 3 continents. This legal revolution begins with a fundamental recognition that has eluded empire builders throughout history. Unity cannot be imposed through force alone. It must be earned through justice. The Mauryan Code establishes universal principles that apply to all subjects of the empire, regardless of their origin or station. These include the right to petition imperial authorities, protection against arbitrary seizure of property, and most revolutionary of all, the concept of legal equality before imperial law regardless of caste, religion, or ethnicity. But the code goes beyond individual rights to address the structural challenges of governing vast distances with ancient technology. It creates a federal system centuries before such concepts would emerge in the West. Local kingdoms and principalities retain significant autonomy over their internal affairs, but certain powers are reserved exclusively to the imperial government. Foreign policy, interregional trade, the maintenance of major infrastructure projects, and the command of the imperial military. This balance between local autonomy and central authority is maintained through an innovation that draws on India's ancient tradition of philosophical debate and legal scholarship. The Mauryan Empire establishes a supreme council of Dharma, composed of the wisest legal scholars, religious leaders, and administrators from across the empire. This body serves as both a supreme court for disputes between regions and a constitutional convention with the power to interpret and modify imperial law as circumstances change. The religious dimension of this legal framework reflects Ashoka's deep understanding of the diverse spiritual traditions within his empire. Rather than imposing Buddhism or Hinduism as a state religion, the Mauryan Code establishes the principle of dharmic pluralism. All religious traditions that promote ethical behavior and social harmony are granted protection and support. Temples, monasteries, and centers of learning receive imperial funding, regardless of their specific theological orientation, creating a vast network of educational institutions that serve as both repositories of knowledge and training grounds for imperial administrators. This approach to religious diversity serves a crucial political function. By embracing rather than suppressing local spiritual traditions, the empire transforms potential sources of rebellion into pillars of stability. Local priests and religious leaders become stakeholders in the imperial system, using their moral authority to promote loyalty to the empire that protects and nurtures their communities. The economic foundation of this vast empire requires innovations that are no less revolutionary than its legal and religious frameworks. The traditional model of ancient empires, based on extracting tribute from conquered territories, would be inadequate for governing an entity that spans such diverse economic zones. Instead, the Mauryan Empire develops what we might recognize as an early form of economic integration. The imperial government standardizes weights, measures, and currency across all its territories, creating for the first time in human history a truly continental market. A merchant in Bactria can trade with a partner in Java using the same silver coins and measuring system, knowing that contracts written in Sanskrit will be enforceable in imperial courts regardless of where disputes arise. This standardization unleashes economic forces that dwarf anything previously seen in the ancient world. The volume of trade flowing through Mauryan territories increases exponentially as barriers between regions disappear. Spices from the Indonesian islands flow westward to Central Asian markets, while silk from Chinese territories moves south through Indian ports to reach buyers as far away as the Arabian Peninsula. The imperial government doesn't just facilitate this trade, it actively invests in the infrastructure necessary to support it. The Mauryan highway system becomes one of the wonders of the ancient world. These roads, built to accommodate both military movements and commercial traffic, stretch from the mountain passes of Afghanistan to the harbours of Southeast Asia. Way stations provide rest and supplies for travellers, while imperial postal relays ensure that messages can travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks rather than months. But perhaps the most impressive achievement of Mauryan engineering is the creation of a canal system that links the major river networks of Asia. Working with local expertise and drawing on centuries of Indian experience with irrigation and water management, imperial engineers create artificial waterways that connect the Ganges system with the rivers of Central Asia and Southeast Asia. These canals serve both military and commercial purposes, allowing the rapid movement of troops and goods across vast distances. The cultural implications of these economic and infrastructural developments are profound. As trade and travel become easier, ideas and innovations spread throughout the empire with unprecedented speed. Mathematical concepts developed in India reach Chinese scholars within months. Astronomical observations made in Central Asia inform calendar reforms across Southeast Asia. Artistic styles and architectural techniques blend and evolve as craftsmen from different regions work together on imperial projects. This cultural cross-pollination creates what historians in our alternate timeline would later call the Mauryan Renaissance. It's a period of explosive creativity and innovation that touches every aspect of human knowledge. The empire's vast network of educational institutions, supported by imperial funding and connected by improved transportation, becomes a laboratory for human advancement on a scale never before imagined. In the field of mathematics, Indian scholars working with Greek geometricians and Chinese algebraists make breakthroughs that advance human understanding by centuries. The concept of zero, already emerging in Indian mathematics, is refined and systematized through collaboration with scholars from across the empire. New methods of calculation and measurement are developed to meet the practical needs of governing such a vast territory. Astronomical knowledge advances even more dramatically. The empire's vast geographical extent allows for observations impossible in smaller kingdoms. Scholars in different regions can coordinate their observations of celestial events, leading to a more accurate understanding of planetary movements and the structure of the cosmos. The Mauryan Astronomical Observatory Network, with facilities from Bactria to Java, produces the most accurate calendar and navigational systems the ancient world has ever known. These scientific advances have immediate practical applications. Improved navigation techniques allow Mauryan merchants and military forces to traverse oceanic distances with greater safety and precision. Better understanding of seasonal weather patterns improves agricultural productivity across the empire's diverse climate zones. Advances in metallurgy and engineering lead to better weapons, tools, and construction techniques. But the most significant cultural development of the Mauryan Renaissance is linguistic. As Sanskrit becomes the administrative language of the empire, it also becomes a vehicle for preserving and transmitting knowledge from dozens of different cultural traditions. Local languages continue to flourish, but Sanskrit serves as a bridge that allows ideas to flow freely across linguistic boundaries. The result is an explosion of literary and philosophical creativity. Epic poems that blend Indian, Greek, and Chinese narrative traditions begin to emerge. Philosophical treatises that synthesize Buddhist, Hindu, and local spiritual traditions are written and copied throughout the empire. Historical chronicles that attempt to understand the empire's rapid expansion and cultural transformation are commissioned by the imperial government and distributed to educational institutions across the realm. This cultural flowering coincides with and supports continued territorial expansion. As Ashoka's immediate successors take power, they inherit not just a vast empire, but a sophisticated system for integrating new territories and populations. The process of expansion becomes increasingly systematic and efficient. The conquest of the remaining independent kingdoms of Southeast Asia proceeds rapidly as local rulers, seeing the prosperity of their neighbors within the empire, voluntarily seek admission rather than face military conquest. The Mauryan model of hegemonic rule, which preserves local autonomy while providing economic and military benefits, proves so attractive that resistance becomes increasingly rare. The expansion into the Indonesian archipelago represents a particular triumph of Mauryan strategy. Rather than attempting to conquer each island individually, the empire focuses on controlling key strategic points while allowing local rulers to maintain their positions as imperial vassals. This approach proves so successful that within 2 generations, the entire archipelago from Sumatra to New Guinea acknowledges Mauryan sovereignty. The integration of Chinese territories proceeds more gradually, but no less successfully. The Han dynasty, facing increasing pressure from nomadic invasions and internal rebellions, finds itself increasingly dependent on Mauryan military and economic support. What begins as a mutual defense alliance gradually evolves into a federal relationship, with Chinese territories retaining their cultural distinctiveness while accepting integration into the broader Mauryan imperial system. This gradual absorption of China brings the Mauryan Empire to the threshold of truly continental dominance. With Chinese territories providing access to Korea and the sea routes to Japan, the empire suddenly finds itself in a position to extend its influence to the furthest reaches of the Asian continent. The wealth generated by controlling the entire network of Asian trade routes provides the resources necessary to support such ambitious expansion. The conquest of Korea proceeds along familiar lines, with Mauryan naval forces establishing bases along the peninsula's southern coast, while diplomats work to secure the voluntary submission of local kingdoms. The Korean rulers, impressed by the prosperity of Chinese territories within the empire and facing their own pressures from nomadic tribes to the north, choose integration over resistance. Japan presents a more complex challenge. The island nation's isolation has allowed it to develop a distinctive culture and political system, while its geography makes direct military conquest difficult and expensive. The Mauryan approach to Japan relies heavily on the same economic and cultural strategies that proved successful elsewhere, but adapted to the unique circumstances of an island civilization. Mauryan merchants, protected by imperial naval forces, established trading posts along the Japanese coast. These commercial outposts become centers for cultural exchange, introducing Japanese elites to the benefits of participation in the continental trade network. Buddhist monks, traveling alongside the merchants, begin the process of cultural integration that has proven so effective elsewhere in the empire. The Japanese response to Mauryan influence reveals both the strengths and limitations of the empire's hegemonic approach. While Japanese elites are attracted to the economic opportunities and cultural sophistication offered by the empire, they remain deeply attached to their own traditions and suspicious of foreign domination. The result is a gradual process of integration that takes place over generations rather than years. As our alternate timeline reaches the end of the 2nd century BCE, the Mauryan Empire has achieved something unprecedented in human history. It governs directly or indirectly virtually the entire Asian continent, from the Mediterranean borders of Central Asia to the Pacific islands of Southeast Asia. Its population approaches 200 million people, making it by far the largest political entity the world has ever known. Yet this very success creates new challenges that will test the empire's institutional foundations. The sheer scale of the empire strains even the most sophisticated administrative systems. Communication between the imperial capital and distant provinces can take months, making centralized decision-making increasingly difficult. The cultural diversity that has been a source of strength also creates potential for fragmentation if imperial institutions weaken. The military challenges are equally daunting. The empire's vast frontiers require enormous numbers of troops to defend, while the diverse geography demands different tactical approaches in different regions. Naval forces must patrol oceanic distances that stretch existing technology to its limits, while land armies must be capable of operating in environments ranging from Central Asian steppes to Southeast Asian jungles. Economic pressures mount as the costs of administration and defense consume ever larger portions of imperial revenues. The empire's prosperity depends on maintaining the trade networks that generate its wealth, but protecting those networks across such vast distances requires military expenditures that threaten to become unsustainable. Perhaps most critically, the empire faces the eternal challenge of political succession on an unprecedented scale. The death of an emperor doesn't just affect a single kingdom, but potentially destabilizes an entire continent. The institutional safeguards created by Ashoka and refined by his successors will face their ultimate test as power passes from one generation to the next. As we drift deeper into our exploration of this alternate history, we begin to see how the very success of Indian unification creates challenges that would reshape not just Asia, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The ripple effects of a unified Asian empire would be felt from Europe to Africa, creating a world so different from our own that even familiar civilizations would become unrecognizable. The ripple effects of Mauryan dominance began to manifest in ways that would forever alter the balance of global power. As news of a unified Asian empire reached the Mediterranean world, the reaction was nothing short of panic among the established powers. The Roman Republic, still consolidating its control over Italy and locked in its death struggle with Carthage, suddenly found itself facing an existential threat from a direction no Roman had ever seriously considered. Imagine the scene in the Roman Senate when the first detailed reports of Mauryan expansion arrived through Greek merchants fleeing the conquered Hellenistic kingdoms. These weren't tales of yet another barbarian tribe or petty Eastern despot, but accounts of a sophisticated empire that dwarfed Rome in every conceivable measure. The Romans, who prided themselves on their military prowess and administrative efficiency, discovered that their entire republic could fit comfortably within a single Mauryan province. The psychological impact on Roman thinking was profound. The confident expansionism that had driven Roman conquest throughout the Mediterranean suddenly gave way to defensive paranoia. Military resources that had been planned for campaigns in Gaul or Africa were instead diverted to hastily constructed fortifications along the empire's eastern approaches. Roman diplomats, who had grown accustomed to dictating terms to defeated enemies, found themselves scrambling to forge defensive alliances with anyone who might serve as a buffer against Mauryan expansion. This shift in Roman strategic thinking would have cascading effects throughout the Mediterranean world. The Punic Wars, which in our timeline established Roman dominance over the Western Mediterranean, might never have reached their decisive conclusion if Rome had been forced to maintain substantial military forces in the east. Carthage, sensing Roman weakness and distraction, could have pressed their advantages more aggressively, potentially altering the entire trajectory of Mediterranean history. The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt found itself in an even more precarious position. Egyptian trade networks, which had grown wealthy by serving as intermediaries between Asia and the Mediterranean, suddenly faced direct competition from Mauryan merchants backed by imperial resources. The Red Sea routes that had been Egyptian monopolies for centuries were now contested by Indian Ocean fleets that could offer better prices and more reliable service. Cleopatra's ancestors, ruling from Alexandria, watched in growing alarm as their kingdom's economic foundation eroded. Egyptian grain, once the most sought-after commodity in Mediterranean markets, now competed with rice from Mauryan territories that could be delivered more cheaply and in greater quantities. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, symbol of Egyptian dominance over Eastern Mediterranean trade, found its beacon dimmed by the rise of new commercial centers in Mauryan ports. But perhaps nowhere were the effects of Mauryan expansion more dramatically felt than in the vast steppes of Central Asia, where nomadic confederations had for centuries raided settled civilizations with impunity. The Scythians, Parthians, and other horse warrior peoples who had terrorized the borders of civilized lands suddenly found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The traditional nomadic strategy of rapid strikes, followed by withdrawal into the depths of the steppe, proved ineffective against an empire that could field armies in multiple directions simultaneously. Mauryan forces, supplied through their sophisticated logistics network and supported by local allies, could maintain pressure on nomadic groups throughout the seasonal cycle that had previously protected them from retaliation. More importantly, the Mauryan Empire offered an alternative to the traditional nomadic way of life. Rather than simply defeating nomadic confederations through military force, the empire integrated them through a combination of economic incentives and cultural adaptation. Nomadic leaders who accepted Mauryan overlordship found themselves granted lucrative positions in the imperial military or administrative hierarchy, while their followers were offered opportunities to settle in newly conquered territories or serve as auxiliary forces in imperial armies. This policy of integration rather than extermination fundamentally altered the dynamics of the Eurasian steppe. The constant pressure of nomadic invasions that had shaped the development of civilizations from China to Persia was suddenly reduced to manageable proportions. The resources that settled societies had been forced to devote to defense could now be redirected toward development and expansion. The effects extended far beyond military considerations. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes connecting East and West, underwent a fundamental transformation under Mauryan hegemony. What had been a dangerous journey through territories controlled by constantly shifting alliances of nomadic tribes became a regulated commercial highway, protected by imperial forces and administered according to standardized laws. The volume of trade flowing along these routes increased exponentially, but more importantly, the nature of that trade evolved. Instead of luxury goods carried by small caravans willing to pay protection money to local strongmen, the Mauryan trade network could support the movement of bulk commodities across continental distances. Grain from Indian territories could feed populations in Central Asia, while minerals extracted from Siberian regions could supply manufacturers throughout the empire. This economic integration created cultural exchanges on an unprecedented scale. The Buddhist monasteries that served as way stations along Mauryan trade routes became centers of learning where scholars from across the known world could meet and exchange ideas. The mathematical innovations of Indian scholars combined with Greek geometric principles and Chinese algebraic methods to produce advances that leaped forward by centuries. The development of papermaking, which in our timeline remained a Chinese monopoly for centuries, spread rapidly throughout the Mauryan Empire as Chinese craftsmen shared their techniques with colleagues from other regions. The result was an explosion of written communication that accelerated the pace of intellectual and administrative development across the empire. Medical knowledge underwent a similar transformation. Indian Ayurvedic traditions combined with Greek anatomical studies and Chinese acupuncture techniques to create medical practices more advanced than anything available in the isolated kingdoms of our historical timeline. The empire's vast network of cities and trade routes allowed medical innovations to spread rapidly, leading to improvements in public health that supported larger populations and more complex societies. The agricultural implications of Mauryan unification were equally revolutionary. The empire's diverse climate zones, from the monsoon regions of Southeast Asia to the arid zones of Central Asia, became complementary components of a single economic system. Crops that could only be grown in specific regions were now available throughout the empire, leading to improvements in nutrition and population growth that provided the human resources necessary for continued expansion. The development of new agricultural techniques proceeded at an accelerated pace as farmers from different regions shared their knowledge. Irrigation methods developed in the arid regions of northwestern India were adapted for use in Central Asian territories, while crop rotation techniques from Chinese agriculture were applied to Southeast Asian rice cultivation. These agricultural innovations supported population growth that provided both the soldiers and administrators necessary for imperial expansion and the craftsmen and merchants who drove economic development. Cities throughout the empire grew rapidly, not just in size, but in sophistication, as imperial resources supported the construction of infrastructure that would have been impossible for individual kingdoms to afford. The cultural implications of this rapid urban growth were profound. Cities like Pataliputra, Taxila, and the emerging metropolis of Mauryan Samarkand became cosmopolitan centers where ideas and artistic traditions from across Asia mingled and evolved. Architectural styles that blended Indian, Greek, and Chinese elements began to appear in cities throughout the empire, creating a distinctive Mauryan aesthetic that reflected the empire's cultural diversity while maintaining visual unity. The development of a distinctively Mauryan artistic tradition had important political implications. Local populations, seeing their own cultural traditions reflected in imperial art and architecture, developed emotional attachments to the empire that went beyond mere economic or military considerations. The empire became not just a political entity, but a cultural identity that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. This cultural integration was facilitated by the empire's educational policies. The network of schools and universities established throughout Mauryan territories created a common intellectual foundation that allowed scholars and administrators from different regions to communicate effectively despite their diverse origins. The curriculum at these institutions, while respecting local traditions, emphasized the universal principles that bound the empire together. The religious dimension of this educational system reflected the empire's approach to spiritual diversity. Rather than imposing a single religious tradition, Mauryan schools taught comparative religion, encouraging students to understand and appreciate the spiritual traditions of all regions within the empire. This approach produced generations of administrators and military officers who could work effectively with populations of diverse religious backgrounds. The military implications of this cultural and educational integration were significant. Mauryan armies became truly cosmopolitan forces, with units that combined soldiers from across the empire under officers trained in standardized military academies. These mixed forces proved more effective than traditional armies composed of single ethnic groups, as they could adapt to diverse tactical situations and operate effectively in unfamiliar territories. The Navy, in particular, benefited from this integration of diverse maritime traditions. Mauryan fleets combined Indian Ocean navigation techniques with Mediterranean shipbuilding methods and Chinese naval technologies to create vessels capable of operations across oceanic distances. These ships, crewed by sailors from across the empire's coastal regions, could maintain the sea lanes that were crucial to imperial unity. The logistical achievements of the Mauryan military were perhaps even more impressive than their tactical innovations. The empire's vast network of roads, canals, and supply depots allowed armies to be supplied and reinforced across distances that would have been impossible for earlier empires to manage. A military campaign launched from India could be sustained in Central Asia or Southeast Asia for years if necessary, giving Mauryan forces decisive advantages over local opponents who lacked such logistical support. These military capabilities enabled continued expansion that brought the empire to the very borders of the known world. Mauryan expeditions reached the Arctic shores of Siberia, where they encountered peoples who had never seen representatives of civilized states. In the south, imperial fleets explored the islands of the Pacific, establishing trading posts and tributary relationships with island communities as far away as the Philippines and possibly even the northern coasts of Australia. The wealth generated by controlling such vast territories and trade networks provided resources for projects that seemed almost impossibly ambitious. The Great Canal system that connected the major river networks of Asia was expanded to include artificial waterways that reached from the Arctic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. These engineering projects, which employed hundreds of thousands of workers and consumed enormous quantities of materials, created transportation networks that bound the empire together more effectively than any military force could have achieved. The administrative challenges of governing such an extensive empire pushed the development of bureaucratic systems far beyond anything previously imagined. The Mauryan civil service, selected through competitive examinations and trained in specialized schools, became a professional class that could administer territories regardless of their cultural or geographic characteristics. These administrators, drawn from across the empire and rotated between different regions, developed loyalties to the imperial system rather than to local interests. The legal framework that supported this administrative system evolved to accommodate the empire's growing complexity. The Mauryan Code, originally designed for governing the Indian subcontinent, was expanded and refined to address the legal traditions of dozens of different cultural groups. Rather than imposing uniformity, this legal system created mechanisms for resolving disputes between different legal traditions while maintaining overarching imperial authority. The economic policies that supported this vast bureaucratic apparatus required innovations in taxation and monetary policy that prefigured developments that wouldn't appear in the West for over a millennium. The empire's standardized currency system, backed by imperial guarantees and accepted throughout the known world, created economic stability that supported trade and development on an unprecedented scale. But as the empire reached these heights of power and sophistication, internal tensions began to emerge that would test the very foundations of Mauryan rule. The success that had made unification possible also created new challenges that threatened to tear the empire apart from within. The question that would dominate the next phase of our alternate history was whether any political system, no matter how sophisticated, could maintain unity across such vast distances and diverse populations when faced with the inevitable succession crises and external pressures that had destroyed every previous empire in human history. The seeds of these future challenges were already visible in the reign of Ashoka's immediate successors, as regional governors began to accumulate power that rivaled that of the emperor himself, and as the costs of maintaining such an extensive empire began to strain even the Mauryan treasury. The stage was being set for conflicts that would determine not just the fate of the Mauryan Empire, but the entire future trajectory of human civilization. The first cracks in the Mauryan edifice appeared not through foreign invasion or natural disaster, but through the very mechanism that had made its expansion possible: the delegation of imperial authority to regional governors. As the empire stretched across 3 continents, the practical realities of ancient communication meant that provincial administrators operated with increasing independence from the imperial center. A message from Pataliputra to the farthest reaches of Central Asia could take 3 months to arrive, and another 3 months for a response to return. In that span of time, local crises demanded immediate decisions that could not wait for imperial approval. The governors who ruled these distant provinces were not mere bureaucrats, but accomplished military commanders and skilled diplomats who had proven their worth in the empire's expansion. Men like Demetrius the Bactrian, who had voluntarily submitted his Greek kingdom to Mauryan rule, or General Surya Gupta, who had conquered the Indonesian archipelago through a brilliant combination of naval warfare and diplomatic negotiation. These provincial rulers commanded not just administrative apparatus, but substantial military forces necessary to defend their territories and maintain order among diverse populations. As decades passed, these regional commanders began to develop independent power bases that rivaled the authority of the imperial center. Their armies, recruited locally and loyal to commanders who had led them to victory, gradually became more attached to their provincial leaders than to the distant emperor in Pataliputra. The wealth generated by regional trade networks flowed increasingly into provincial treasuries rather than imperial coffers, as governors found reasons to delay or reduce their tribute payments to the central government. This gradual decentralization of power was accelerated by the cultural dynamics of ruling such a diverse empire. Provincial governors, to be effective, had to adapt to local customs and traditions. A Mauryan administrator in Java needed to understand Malay political traditions and religious practices. A governor in Central Asia had to navigate the complex tribal loyalties of nomadic confederations. Over time, these administrators became as much local leaders as imperial representatives. Their loyalties divided between the empire that had appointed them and the populations they governed. The imperial court in Pataliputra watched these developments with growing alarm, but found itself facing an impossible dilemma. Replacing successful provincial governors risked rebellion and the loss of entire territories, but allowing them to continue accumulating independent power threatened the unity of the empire itself. The sophisticated administrative systems that Ashoka had created to govern a continental empire began to work against imperial unity as regional bureaucracies developed their own institutional interests and cultural identities. Emperor Bindusara II, Ashoka's great-grandson, attempted to address these centrifugal forces through a policy of imperial rotation, requiring provincial governors to move between different territories every 5 years. The theory was sound. Preventing administrators from developing deep local roots would maintain their loyalty to the imperial system. In practice, however, this policy created new problems. Governors who knew they would be transferred had little incentive to invest in long-term development of their territories, while the constant turnover of leadership created instability that local populations found increasingly intolerable. The rotation policy also failed to account for the specialized knowledge required to govern different regions effectively. A commander who had mastered the art of governing Chinese territories might prove completely ineffective when transferred to Southeast Asian provinces with entirely different cultural, economic, and military challenges. The result was a decline in administrative efficiency that threatened the economic foundations of imperial power. More dangerously, the rotation policy encouraged the formation of networks among provincial governors who saw the imperial court as their common enemy. Secret communications between regional administrators began to increase as governors shared information about imperial policies and coordinated their responses to central government directives. What had begun as individual instances of provincial independence gradually evolved into something approaching organized resistance to imperial authority. The economic pressures facing the empire compounded these political tensions. The costs of maintaining the vast military forces necessary to defend continental frontiers consumed an ever-increasing portion of imperial revenues. The engineering projects that bound the empire together, the canal systems and road networks that made continental administration possible, required constant maintenance and periodic reconstruction that strained the imperial treasury. Meanwhile, the very success of Mauryan trade policies created new economic challenges. The standardization of currency and commercial law that had facilitated continental trade also made the empire vulnerable to economic disruptions that could spread rapidly across vast distances. A harvest failure in one region could trigger price fluctuations that destabilized markets throughout the empire. A disruption of trade routes caused by nomadic raids or natural disasters could affect the prosperity of territories thousands of miles away. The empire's monetary system, based on silver coins, minted in imperial facilities and guaranteed by imperial authority, began to show signs of strain as the costs of government exceeded the empire's ability to generate revenue. The temptation to debase the currency by reducing its silver content became increasingly attractive to imperial treasurers facing impossible budgetary demands. But any reduction in the value of Mauryan currency threatened to undermine the trade networks that were the empire's economic lifeblood. These fiscal pressures were exacerbated by demographic changes within the empire. The prosperity and internal peace that Mauryan rule had brought to Asia had triggered population growth that strained the agricultural systems of many regions. Cities that had flourished under imperial rule now faced problems of overcrowding and resource scarcity that their local governments were ill-equipped to address. The migration of populations from rural areas to urban centres created social tensions that provincial administrators struggled to manage. The empire's military recruitment system, which had relied on volunteer service supplemented by conscription from agricultural communities, began to face serious challenges as population growth outpaced agricultural productivity. Young men who might previously have served in imperial armies were needed to work increasingly intensive agricultural systems. At the same time, the growing wealth disparity between urban merchants and rural farmers created social resentments that complicated military recruitment efforts. These internal pressures were magnified by external threats that tested the empire's military capabilities. The nomadic confederations of the northern steppes, temporarily subdued by Mauryan expansion, began to reorganize under new leadership that had learned from their previous defeats. These neo-nomadic movements adopted Mauryan military technologies and tactical innovations while retaining their traditional mobility advantages. The result was a new generation of steppe warriors who posed a more serious threat to imperial frontiers than their predecessors had ever managed. In the West, the Roman Republic, having finally resolved its conflict with Carthage, began to probe the eastern limits of Mauryan influence. Roman expeditions into Armenia and Mesopotamia brought them into contact with Mauryan client states and tributary peoples, who reported back to Pataliputra about Roman military capabilities and territorial ambitions. The prospect of conflict with another major imperial power forced Mauryan military planners to consider scenarios they had never previously faced. The technological advantages that had enabled Mauryan expansion were gradually being eroded as military innovations spread to potential enemies. The superior metallurgy that had given Mauryan armies decisive advantages in earlier campaigns was now available to opponents who had captured Mauryan weapons or recruited Mauryan craftsmen. The naval technologies that had enabled the conquest of Southeast Asia were being copied by local shipbuilders who could produce vessels capable of challenging Mauryan maritime supremacy. Perhaps most troubling for imperial planners was the spread of Mauryan administrative and military knowledge to potential rivals. Former imperial officials who had been dismissed or had fallen from favor carried detailed knowledge of imperial strengths and weaknesses to foreign courts. Mercenary commanders who had served in Mauryan armies offered their expertise to anyone willing to pay for it. The very openness and cultural integration that had made Mauryan expansion possible now threatened to provide enemies with the tools necessary to challenge imperial power. These challenges converged in the reign of Emperor Samprati, Ashoka's great-great-grandson, who inherited an empire that had reached the limits of sustainable expansion. The territories under Mauryan control stretched across such vast distances that effective central administration had become nearly impossible. The cultural diversity that had been a source of strength during the empire's expansion now threatened to become a source of fragmentation as regional identities grew stronger and imperial identity grew weaker. Samprati's attempts to address these challenges through administrative reform met with resistance from provincial governors who had grown accustomed to operating with minimal interference from Pataliputra. His efforts to centralize military command encountered opposition from regional commanders who argued that local conditions required local decision-making authority. His initiatives to standardize legal and cultural practices across the empire sparked rebellions among populations who saw such policies as attacks on their traditional ways of life. The emperor found himself caught between the impossible demands of governing a continental empire and the equally impossible costs of maintaining the military and administrative apparatus necessary to hold such an empire together. Every solution to one problem seemed to create new problems elsewhere. Reducing military expenditures weakened frontier defenses and encouraged external threats. Increasing taxation to fund military expansion triggered internal rebellions. Granting greater autonomy to provincial governors reduced imperial authority, while centralizing power created administrative bottlenecks that paralyzed government effectiveness. The crisis came to a head in the winter of 185 BCE, when a confederation of Central Asian governors declared their independence from Mauryan rule and formed the Northern Alliance, a military and economic partnership dedicated to resisting imperial authority. This rebellion was not the work of disloyal provincial administrators seeking personal gain, but a coordinated political movement led by men who genuinely believed that the empire had grown too large to be governed effectively from a single center. The Northern Alliance controlled territories that were crucial to the empire's economic and strategic position. The trade routes connecting East and West passed through their domains, while their military forces included some of the empire's most experienced cavalry units. Most dangerously, the alliance offered an alternative model of political organization that appealed to other provincial governors who were growing frustrated with imperial policies. Emperor Samprati's response to this challenge would determine not just the fate of the rebellious provinces, but the future of the entire Mauryan Empire. The military forces available to the imperial government were still formidable, but they were scattered across vast territories and could not be concentrated quickly enough to crush the rebellion before it spread to other regions. The economic resources of the empire remained substantial, but they were increasingly difficult to access as provincial governors delayed tribute payments and trade disruptions reduced imperial revenues. The cultural and religious networks that had bound the empire together during its expansion now became battlegrounds where competing visions of Asian unity struggled for supremacy. Buddhist monasteries that had served as centers of imperial administration found themselves torn between loyalty to the emperor and sympathy for regional populations who saw the central government as increasingly distant and oppressive. Hindu temples that had flourished under imperial patronage began to question whether their interests were better served by a weakened central authority or by stronger regional governments. The intellectual and artistic communities that had created the Mauryan Renaissance faced their own crisis of loyalty. The cosmopolitan culture that had emerged from imperial unification depended on the trade networks and institutional support that only a continental empire could provide. Yet the political and military conflicts that threatened to tear the empire apart made it increasingly difficult to maintain the scholarly exchanges and artistic collaborations that had made the Renaissance possible. As winter gave way to spring in 184 BCE, the Mauryan Empire stood at a crossroads that would determine not just its own survival, but the entire trajectory of Asian and world history. The forces that had made continental unification possible were now threatening to tear that unity apart, while new challenges emerged that would test every institution and innovation that had made the empire's expansion successful. The question that haunted imperial councils and provincial assemblies alike was whether the dream of Asian unity could survive the realities of governing a continent, or whether the Mauryan Empire would join the long list of ambitious political experiments that had collapsed under the weight of their own success. The answer to that question would reshape not just the political map of Asia, but the fundamental assumptions about what was possible in human political organization. In the palace at Pataliputra, as Emperor Samprati prepared for what might be the final campaign of Mauryan history, the weight of 5 centuries of imperial expansion pressed down upon decisions that would echo through the ages. The fate of 200 million people, spread across 3 continents and speaking dozens of languages, hung in the balance of choices that would have to be made in the coming months. The great experiment in continental unity was about to face its ultimate test, and the outcome would determine whether the dream of a unified Asia would survive to inspire future generations, or whether it would become merely another cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition. The answer came not through grand military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations, but through a revolutionary concept that would transform the very nature of imperial governance. Emperor Samprati, faced with the impossible choice between crushing the Northern Alliance through devastating civil war or watching his empire fragment into competing kingdoms, chose a third path that no ruler in human history had ever attempted on such a scale. Rather than viewing the rebellion as a threat to be eliminated, Samprati began to see it as an inevitable evolution of imperial organization. The empire had simply grown beyond the capacity of any single center to govern effectively. But what if, instead of fighting this reality, the imperial system could be redesigned to work with it rather than against it? What if the Mauryan Empire could transform itself from a centralized monarchy into something entirely new, a continental confederation of autonomous regions bound together by shared interests rather than imperial compulsion? The concept that emerged from months of secret negotiations between Pataliputra and the Northern Alliance was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. The Mauryan Empire would voluntarily reorganize itself into the Asian Commonwealth, a federal system that preserved continental unity while granting substantial autonomy to regional governments. Each major cultural and geographic region would govern its own internal affairs while participating in empire-wide institutions that managed defense, trade, and diplomatic relations. This transformation required abandoning traditional concepts of imperial authority that had shaped political thinking since the dawn of civilization. No longer would there be a single emperor commanding absolute obedience from subjects scattered across 3 continents. Instead, the Commonwealth would be governed by an Asian council composed of representatives from each regional confederation, with executive authority rotating among different regions according to a carefully negotiated schedule. The genius of this system lay in its recognition that the forces threatening to tear the empire apart could instead become the foundations of a new form of unity. Regional identity, rather than being suppressed as a threat to imperial authority, would be celebrated as a source of strength that contributed to the diversity and resilience of the Commonwealth. Cultural differences that had created administrative challenges would now be viewed as assets that enhanced the Confederation's ability to adapt to different circumstances and opportunities. The military implications of this transformation were particularly innovative. Rather than maintaining vast standing armies that consumed enormous resources while remaining idle for most of their existence, the Commonwealth would rely on a system of regional militias coordinated by a small professional corps of officers trained in standardized military academies. Each region would be responsible for defending its own territory, while contributing forces to Commonwealth-wide campaigns when external threats required coordinated responses. This military restructuring addressed several problems that had plagued the empire's later years. Regional forces, recruited locally and commanded by officers familiar with local conditions, proved more effective at dealing with the specific challenges of their territories than imperial armies commanded from distant capitals. The reduced cost of maintaining smaller professional forces freed resources for investment in the economic and technological development that would strengthen the Commonwealth's long-term position. The economic benefits of federal reorganization were even more dramatic. Instead of extracting tribute from conquered territories to support an imperial center, the Commonwealth created a system of mutual economic support that maximized the prosperity of all regions. Trade barriers between regions were eliminated entirely, while investment flowed freely to wherever it could generate the highest returns, regardless of political boundaries. This economic integration reached levels that would not be matched in the West for over a millennium. A merchant in Bactria could invest in agricultural development projects in Java, knowing that Commonwealth law would protect his interests regardless of local political changes. A craftsman in Pataliputra could establish workshops in Chinese territories with confidence that standardized weights, measures, and currency would allow his products to compete fairly in all Commonwealth markets. The technological implications of this economic integration were profound. Innovation no longer depended on the resources and interests of a single imperial court, but emerged from competitive collaboration between regions seeking to maximize their contributions to Commonwealth prosperity. The mathematical advances that had characterized the Mauryan Renaissance accelerated as scholars from different regions competed to solve practical problems of engineering, navigation, and administration. The development of new transportation technologies proceeded at a pace that seemed almost miraculous to contemporary observers. The canal systems that connected Asia's major river networks were expanded and refined, using engineering techniques that combined the expertise of all Commonwealth regions. New types of ships, designed through collaboration between Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific maritime traditions, made oceanic trade safer and more profitable than ever before. But perhaps the most significant innovation was in the field of communication. The Commonwealth's vast distances and complex political structure created an urgent need for faster and more reliable methods of transmitting information. The result was the development of an optical telegraph system that used mirrors and signal fires to relay messages across continental distances in a matter of days rather than months. This communication network, stretching from the Atlantic approaches of Central Asia to the Pacific islands of Southeast Asia, created an information infrastructure that bound the Commonwealth together more effectively than any military force could have achieved. Regional governments could coordinate their policies in response to changing circumstances, while merchants and scholars could maintain relationships and collaborations across vast distances. The cultural implications of these technological advances were equally revolutionary. The Commonwealth's commitment to preserving regional diversity while facilitating inter-regional communication created a flowering of artistic and intellectual creativity that surpassed even the achievements of the Mauryan Renaissance. Local traditions, instead of being homogenized by imperial pressure, were refined and enhanced through contact with complementary traditions from other regions. The development of a Commonwealth literary tradition exemplified this cultural synthesis. Epic poems that began in one region were continued by poets in others, creating collaborative works that spanned continents and generations. Historical chronicles that attempted to capture the Commonwealth's complex evolution were written by teams of scholars from different cultural backgrounds, producing accounts that reflected multiple perspectives while maintaining narrative coherence. The philosophical implications of Commonwealth organization challenged fundamental assumptions about political authority and social organization that had shaped human thinking since the emergence of complex societies. The idea that legitimate government required a single sovereign authority was replaced by concepts of distributed sovereignty and consensual governance that prefigured political developments that would not appear in the West for centuries. These philosophical innovations had practical implications that transformed daily life throughout the Commonwealth. Legal disputes that crossed regional boundaries were resolved through arbitration systems that drew on the legal traditions of all affected regions. Commercial contracts were governed by Commonwealth-wide commercial codes that protected the interests of all parties regardless of their origins or destinations. The educational systems that supported these legal and commercial innovations created a new type of citizen, individuals who maintained strong attachments to their local communities while participating effectively in Commonwealth-wide institutions. Schools throughout the Confederation taught local languages and traditions alongside Sanskrit and the universal principles that bound the Commonwealth together. This educational approach produced generations of administrators, merchants, and scholars who could work effectively anywhere within the Commonwealth while retaining the cultural knowledge necessary to serve their home regions. The result was a level of cultural competence and political sophistication that enabled the Commonwealth to function effectively despite its enormous complexity. The religious dimension of Commonwealth organisation reflected the same principles of unity through diversity that characterised its political and economic systems. Rather than establishing a single state religion or attempting to suppress religious differences, the Commonwealth created institutions that celebrated spiritual diversity while identifying common ethical principles that transcended sectarian boundaries. Buddhist monasteries, Hindu temples, and local spiritual traditions all received Commonwealth support and protection, while interfaith councils worked to resolve conflicts and promote mutual understanding. This approach to religious diversity created a stability and tolerance that attracted refugees and immigrants from less tolerant societies, further enriching the Commonwealth's cultural mix. The international implications of Commonwealth success were profound and far-reaching. The Roman Republic, watching the transformation of its potential rival from a threatening empire into a prosperous confederation, was forced to reconsider its own expansionist policies. The model of voluntary association and mutual benefit offered by the Commonwealth presented an alternative to the Roman system of conquest and tribute that proved increasingly attractive to potential allies and subjects. Greek city-states and kingdoms, many of which had been absorbed into the Roman sphere of influence through military pressure, began to look eastward toward the Commonwealth as an example of how diverse political entities could maintain their independence while participating in larger political and economic systems. The result was a gradual shift in the balance of Mediterranean politics that reduced Roman influence while increasing the attractiveness of Commonwealth partnership. The nomadic confederations of Central Asia, which had posed constant threats to settled civilizations throughout history, found themselves faced with a new type of challenge. The Commonwealth's federal structure made it impossible to play regional governments against each other, while its economic opportunities offered alternatives to raiding that proved more profitable and sustainable than traditional nomadic lifestyles. Many nomadic groups chose to settle within Commonwealth territories, bringing their military skills and pastoral expertise to serve the Confederation's defense and economic needs. Others maintained their traditional lifestyles while accepting Commonwealth protection and participating in Commonwealth trade networks. The result was a gradual pacification of the Eurasian steppes that eliminated one of the major sources of instability that had plagued civilized societies for millennia. The success of this integration process encouraged the Commonwealth to extend its model to other regions, where civilized and nomadic peoples had traditionally been in conflict. Expeditions to the northern forests of Siberia and the southern deserts of Arabia established trading posts and diplomatic relationships that gradually brought these regions into the Commonwealth's sphere of influence. These expansions, unlike the military conquests of the original Mauryan Empire, proceeded through voluntary association and mutual benefit rather than force. Local populations, seeing the prosperity of Commonwealth regions and the protection offered by Commonwealth membership, increasingly sought to join the Confederation rather than resist its expansion. The technological capabilities that made such far-flung expansion possible continued to advance at an accelerating pace. The Commonwealth's competitive federal structure encouraged innovation, while its vast resources provided the means to implement new technologies on a continental scale. Improvements in agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation created prosperity that supported ever larger populations and more complex social systems. The development of new mathematical and scientific methods, emerging from collaboration between scholars from across the Commonwealth, produced insights that advanced human understanding in every field of knowledge. Astronomical observations coordinated across the Commonwealth's vast territories led to more accurate calendars and navigational systems. Medical knowledge, synthesized from the healing traditions of dozens of cultures, produced treatments and preventive measures that dramatically improved public health. These advances in knowledge and technology began to attract attention from beyond the Commonwealth's borders. Scholars and craftsmen from Africa, Europe, and the Americas sought to study in Commonwealth institutions and learn the techniques that had made the Confederation so prosperous and powerful. The result was a gradual diffusion of Commonwealth innovations that accelerated technological development throughout the known world. But the Commonwealth's greatest achievement was not technological or economic, but social and political. For the first time in human history, a political system had been created that could maintain unity across continental distances without suppressing the diversity that made such unity valuable. The Commonwealth demonstrated that human societies could evolve beyond the cycle of conquest and collapse that had characterized all previous empires. This achievement had implications that extended far beyond Asia. The Commonwealth's example inspired political movements in other regions that sought to create similar confederations based on voluntary association and mutual benefit. The success of these movements would gradually transform the global political landscape, creating a world where cooperation replaced conquest as the primary means of organizing human societies. As the Commonwealth entered its second century, its founders' vision of Asian unity had been not just achieved, but transcended. What had begun as an attempt to prevent imperial collapse had evolved into a new form of human organization that offered hope for a future where the benefits of civilization could be extended to all humanity without the costs of oppression and exploitation that had characterized previous attempts at large-scale political organization. The dream of unity through diversity, born in the crisis of Mauryan imperial overextension, had become a reality that would shape the trajectory of human development for centuries to come. In the gentle twilight of our alternate history, as you drift towards sleep, consider how different our world might have been if such wisdom had guided the ambitions of empire builders throughout the ages. The morning sun rises over the Commonwealth territories, casting its golden light across a network of cities that would have been unimaginable to the ancient world. From the bustling harbours of Kalinga, where ships from across the known world dock daily, to the mountain passes of Gandhara, where caravans rest at way stations maintained by Commonwealth engineers, the evidence of this grand experiment in human organisation stretches as far as the eye can see. But success, as any student of history knows, carries within it the seeds of new challenges. The very prosperity that the Commonwealth had achieved began to attract attention from quarters that viewed such success with a mixture of envy and alarm. Beyond the Confederation's borders, older forms of political organisation struggled to compete with the attractive model of voluntary association and shared prosperity that the Asian experiment represented. In the western reaches of the known world, where Roman legions had grown accustomed to extracting tribute from conquered peoples, reports from Commonwealth territories spoke of something that seemed almost impossible to believe. Here was a political system where conquered peoples were not merely subjects, but partners. Where regional governors ruled not through fear of distant emperors, but through the consent of populations who saw their own interests reflected in the larger confederation's success. The Roman Senate, meeting in emergency session as reports of Commonwealth expansion, filtered westward through Greek merchants and diplomatic envoys, found itself grappling with concepts that challenged the very foundations of Roman political thinking. How could an empire function without absolute authority flowing from a single center? How could diverse peoples be held together without the threat of military retribution for disobedience? Most puzzling of all, how could such a system generate the wealth and military power necessary to defend itself against more traditional forms of imperial organization? These questions became more urgent as Commonwealth influence began to reach the Eastern Mediterranean. The Seleucid Empire, that remnant of Alexander's conquests that had managed to survive the rise of Roman power in the West and Parthian pressure from the East, found itself facing a new type of challenge. Commonwealth merchants operating under the protection of their confederation's naval forces began to offer terms of trade that local rulers found impossible to match. The key to Commonwealth commercial success lay not in the exploitation of captive markets, but in the creation of genuine economic partnerships. When Commonwealth traders arrived in a new port, they came not as conquerors seeking tribute, but as partners offering access to the vast internal markets of the Asian Confederation. Local producers found that they could sell their goods throughout Asia under Commonwealth protection, while gaining access to products and technologies that had never before been available in their regions. This economic integration proceeded so gradually and beneficially that local populations often found themselves drawn into the Commonwealth sphere of influence before their rulers fully understood what was happening. A port city that began by hosting Commonwealth trading missions would gradually adopt Commonwealth commercial practices, legal codes, and administrative methods simply because they proved more efficient and profitable than traditional systems. The cultural implications of this economic integration were equally profound. Commonwealth traders brought with them not just goods, but ideas. The mathematical innovations that had emerged from the collaboration of Indian, Greek, and Chinese scholars spread rapidly through these commercial networks. Engineering techniques that had been developed to support the Commonwealth's vast infrastructure projects were adapted to solve local problems in distant territories. Perhaps most significantly, the Commonwealth's approach to governance itself became a subject of intense interest among populations that had grown weary of traditional forms of imperial rule. The idea that political authority could be based on consent rather than conquest, that regional identities could be preserved within larger political frameworks, that prosperity could be shared rather than extracted, offered hope to peoples who had known only exploitation and oppression. This ideological challenge to traditional imperial systems created diplomatic crises that rippled across the ancient world. Roman allies began to question why they should continue to accept tributary status when the Commonwealth offered partnership. Greek city-states that had submitted to Roman authority began to explore whether they might find better terms through association with the Asian Confederation. The Parthian Empire, that great rival to Roman power in the East, found itself caught between the expansion of Roman influence from the West and the growing attraction of Commonwealth partnership from the East. Parthian nobles, traditionally committed to maintaining their independence from all foreign entanglements, began to debate whether their kingdom's interests might be better served through some form of association with the prosperous confederation that controlled the wealth of Asia. These debates were not merely academic exercises conducted in royal courts and philosophical schools. They reflected real economic and military pressures that were reshaping the balance of power throughout the known world. The Commonwealth's success had created a new standard by which all other political systems would be measured, and that standard was proving difficult for traditional empires to meet. The military implications of Commonwealth expansion were particularly troubling for established powers. The Confederation's federal structure made it virtually impossible for enemies to achieve decisive victories through traditional military campaigns. There was no single capital whose capture would cripple the entire system, no single ruler whose defeat would throw the Confederation into chaos. Instead, any military campaign against the Commonwealth would face the prospect of fighting not one unified enemy, but a network of regional forces that could support each other while maintaining independent decision-making capabilities. The Roman military machine, designed to crush centralized opponents through overwhelming force concentrated at decisive points, found itself facing a strategic puzzle that its tactical doctrines were ill-equipped to solve. The Commonwealth's military innovations compounded these strategic challenges. The Confederation's competitive federal structure had encouraged rapid technological development in military as well as civilian applications. New types of armor, forged using techniques that combined Indian metallurgy with Chinese alloying methods, provided protection superior to anything available to Commonwealth enemies. Siege engines that incorporated mathematical principles developed in Commonwealth academies could breach fortifications that had previously been considered impregnable. But perhaps the most significant military advantage enjoyed by the Commonwealth was the logistical. The vast transportation networks that supported the Confederation's economic integration could also support military operations on a scale that traditional empires could not match. A Commonwealth army operating in Central Asia could be supplied and reinforced from bases stretching from India to the Pacific, while enemy forces found themselves isolated in hostile territory with no reliable sources of supply or reinforcement. These military capabilities enabled the Commonwealth to project power far beyond its traditional boundaries, but the Confederation's leaders showed remarkable restraint in the use of force. Having learned from the experiences of the original Mauryan Empire, Commonwealth policy emphasized economic and cultural influence over military conquest. The goal was not to impose Commonwealth rule on reluctant populations, but to make Commonwealth partnerships so attractive that voluntary association became the preferred choice. This strategy proved remarkably effective in regions where traditional imperial systems had created widespread dissatisfaction. The Celtic tribes of Western Europe, facing increasing pressure from Roman expansion, began to send diplomatic missions to Commonwealth territories, seeking information about Confederation membership requirements. Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier established trading relationships with Commonwealth merchants that gradually evolved into more formal political associations. Even more dramatically, several Roman client kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean began to explore whether they might find better terms through Commonwealth partnership than through continued subordination to Roman authority. The Kingdom of Armenia, perpetually caught between Roman and Parthian spheres of influence, sent secret envoys to Commonwealth diplomatic missions seeking assurances of protection should they choose to reject both traditional options in favor of Confederation membership. These diplomatic developments created a crisis of confidence within the Roman system that went far beyond mere military concerns. The Roman Empire had been built on the assumption that conquered peoples would prefer the stability of Roman rule to the chaos of independence. The Commonwealth's success demonstrated that there were alternatives to Roman-style imperialism that could provide both stability and prosperity while preserving local autonomy and cultural identity. The intellectual response to this challenge produced some of the most sophisticated political writing in Roman history. Philosophers and historians attempted to analyze the Commonwealth system to understand how it had achieved such remarkable success. Some argued that the Confederation's achievements were temporary, that the centrifugal forces that had destroyed all previous large-scale political organizations would eventually tear the Commonwealth apart as well. Others took a more pragmatic approach, suggesting that Rome should adapt some Commonwealth methods to strengthen its own imperial system. These reformers argued for granting greater autonomy to provincial governments, reducing the tribute burden on conquered territories, and creating more opportunities for local populations to participate in imperial administration. The most radical Roman thinkers went further, suggesting that the empire should consider transforming itself into a confederation similar to the Commonwealth model. These proposals, while never seriously considered by the conservative Roman Senate, reflected a growing recognition that traditional methods of imperial organization were facing unprecedented challenges. The crisis of confidence was not limited to Rome. Throughout the ancient world, established powers found themselves forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about political organization and imperial administration. The Persian Empire, already weakened by conflicts with Rome and internal rebellions, watched nervously as Commonwealth influence spread through the trade routes that connected Asia with the Mediterranean world. Egyptian rulers, nominally independent but increasingly dependent on Roman protection, began to calculate whether their kingdom's interests might be better served through association with the prosperous Asian Confederation rather than continued subordination to Roman power. The wealth generated by Commonwealth trade networks offered opportunities for economic development that Egyptian agriculture alone could never provide. Even in distant regions that had no direct contact with Commonwealth territories, news of the Confederation's success inspired political movements that challenged traditional forms of authority. In North Africa, tribal confederations began to experiment with federal structures that mimicked Commonwealth organization. In Spain, Celtic and Iberian communities explored whether they might create their own confederations to resist Roman expansion more effectively. The ideological impact of these developments extended far beyond immediate political concerns. The Commonwealth had demonstrated that large-scale political organization did not require the suppression of local identities and traditions. This realization opened up possibilities for human social organization that had never before been seriously considered. The religious implications were equally profound. The Commonwealth's success in managing religious diversity while maintaining political unity challenged assumptions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority that had shaped political thinking since the emergence of complex societies. The Confederation's approach to religious tolerance, based on finding common ethical principles while celebrating doctrinal diversity, offered a model that could potentially resolve conflicts that had plagued human societies for centuries. These philosophical and religious innovations spread through the same commercial and diplomatic networks that carried Commonwealth political influence. Buddhist monasteries in regions far from Asia began to adopt organizational methods developed in Commonwealth territories. Christian communities in the Eastern Mediterranean incorporated Commonwealth approaches to managing diversity within their own ecclesiastical structures. The educational systems that supported these cultural innovations became objects of intense interest throughout the ancient world. The Commonwealth's approach to education, which emphasized both local cultural knowledge and universal principles of mathematics, natural philosophy, and political organization, produced citizens who could function effectively in the Confederation's complex federal structure while maintaining strong attachments to their home communities. Foreign students began to seek admission to Commonwealth educational institutions, bringing back to their home regions not just technical knowledge, but new ideas about social organization and political authority. These intellectual exchanges accelerated the diffusion of Commonwealth innovations, while creating networks of personal relationships that strengthened the Confederation's diplomatic influence. The long-term implications of these educational and cultural exchanges were becoming apparent as the Commonwealth entered its third generation. A new type of political leader was emerging throughout the ancient world, individuals who had been exposed to Commonwealth ideas about governance and social organization, and who were applying these concepts to the challenges facing their own communities. These leaders, whether they governed Roman provinces, Persian satrapies, or independent city-states, shared a common understanding of political possibilities that transcended traditional boundaries of culture and geography. They formed networks of communication and cooperation that operated independently of formal diplomatic channels, creating what amounted to an international community of leaders committed to peaceful competition rather than military conquest. The emergence of this international community marked a fundamental shift in the nature of political relationships throughout the ancient world. For the first time in human history, it became possible to envision a global system based on voluntary cooperation rather than imperial domination. The Commonwealth's example had demonstrated that such cooperation could generate prosperity and stability superior to anything achieved through traditional methods of conquest and tribute extraction. But as the Confederation's influence continued to expand, new challenges began to emerge that would test the fundamental assumptions underlying the Commonwealth system. The very success that had made the Confederation attractive to voluntary associates also created expectations that might prove impossible to fulfill. Regions that joined the Commonwealth expecting immediate prosperity and protection found that the benefits of membership came with obligations that not all populations were prepared to accept. The question that would dominate the next phase of our alternate history was whether the Commonwealth's federal structure could adapt to accommodate the diverse needs and expectations of an ever-expanding membership. Could a political system designed to unite the culturally related regions of Asia successfully integrate populations from Africa, Europe, and eventually the Americas? Or would the attempt to create a truly global confederation exceed the capacity of any human institution to manage effectively? The answer to these questions would determine not just the fate of the Commonwealth itself, but the entire trajectory of human political development. The experiment in continental unity that had begun with Ashoka's vision of Asian empire had evolved into something far grander and more ambitious. An attempt to create a global system of governance based on consent rather than conquest, cooperation rather than competition, shared prosperity rather than exploitation. As our journey through this alternate history draws toward its conclusion, we find ourselves contemplating possibilities that stretch the boundaries of historical imagination. In a world where ancient India had successfully unified Asia under the Commonwealth model, the entire course of human development would have been fundamentally altered. The rise of Rome might have been contained within the Mediterranean basin. The great migrations of peoples that reshaped medieval Europe might never have occurred, and the age of European colonial expansion might have been replaced by an age of global confederation and voluntary association. The technologies that emerge from Commonwealth innovation, the political concepts that developed from Commonwealth governance, and the cultural syntheses that flowered under Commonwealth protection would have created a human civilization radically different from the one we know. Instead of the cycles of conquest and collapse that characterized our historical timeline, humanity might have discovered sustainable forms of large-scale organization that could have prevented many of the conflicts and catastrophes that have marked our actual past. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of these speculations, consider how the choices made by a few key individuals in crucial moments can reshape the destiny of entire civilizations. The alternate world we have explored tonight exists only in the realm of possibility, but the principles that made Commonwealth success possible, the recognition that unity can be achieved through diversity rather than uniformity, that prosperity can be shared rather than hoarded, that political authority can be based on consent rather than conquest, remain as relevant today as they would have been in ancient Asia. The dream of human unity that inspired our imaginary Commonwealth continues to inspire real efforts to create international institutions based on cooperation rather than domination. In our world, as in our alternate history, the greatest challenges facing humanity require solutions that transcend traditional boundaries of nation, culture, and ideology. The vision of what might have been can inspire our efforts to create what might yet be as we continue the eternal human quest to build societies worthy of our highest aspirations and deepest hopes. In the quiet darkness that surrounds you now, let the echoes of this vanished world remind you that history is not a fixed narrative, but a continuing story in which each of us plays a part. The choices we make, like those of our imaginary emperors and confederate leaders, have consequences that ripple through time in ways we can barely imagine. The future remains unwritten, and the dreams of unity and prosperity that animated our alternate Commonwealth remain within the realm of human possibility, waiting for new generations of visionaries to transform them from speculation into reality. The Commonwealth's expansion into regions beyond Asia brought with it challenges that its founders could never have anticipated. as Confederation membership extended to territories with fundamentally different historical experiences, cultural foundations, and economic structures. The delicate balance between unity and diversity that had made Asian integration possible began to face unprecedented strain. The Celtic tribes of Western Gaul, among the first European peoples to seek Commonwealth association, brought with them political traditions based on warrior aristocracies and tribal assemblies that bore little resemblance to the sophisticated administrative systems that had evolved in Asian territories. These peoples had no experience with the written legal codes, standardized currency systems, or professional bureaucracies that formed the backbone of Commonwealth governance. Yet their inclusion in the Confederation was deemed essential by Commonwealth strategists who recognized that European membership could provide crucial buffers against Roman expansion while opening new trade routes to the Atlantic world. The challenge lay in adapting Commonwealth institutions to accommodate populations whose entire worldview had been shaped by centuries of small-scale tribal warfare and seasonal migration patterns. The solution emerged through a process of institutional innovation that demonstrated the Commonwealth's remarkable capacity for adaptive governance. Rather than imposing Asian administrative models on European territories, Confederation leaders developed hybrid systems that preserved essential Celtic political traditions while gradually introducing Commonwealth legal and economic frameworks. Celtic tribal councils were transformed into regional assemblies with representation in the broader Commonwealth political structure. Traditional warrior bands were reconstituted as militia units that could contribute to Confederation defense while maintaining their cultural identity and local loyalties. Most ingeniously, the Celtic bardic tradition of oral law and historical memory was integrated with Commonwealth written legal codes to create new forms of jurisprudence that drew on both traditions. This process of cultural synthesis produced innovations that enrich the entire Commonwealth system. Celtic expertise in metalworking, developed through centuries of crafting weapons and tools for warrior societies, combined with Asian technological knowledge to produce new alloys and manufacturing techniques that advanced the Confederation's military and economic capabilities. Celtic knowledge of Atlantic navigation, accumulated through generations of coastal trading and raiding, opened new maritime possibilities that had been closed to Asian seafarers. The integration of European territories also brought the Commonwealth into direct contact with the expanding Roman Empire, creating the first serious external military threat that the Confederation had faced since its transformation from imperial to federal structure. Roman legions, advancing through Gaul and approaching the Rhine frontier, suddenly found themselves confronting not scattered tribal opponents, but organized resistance backed by the vast resources of the Asian Commonwealth. The initial military encounters between Roman and Commonwealth forces revealed fundamental differences in strategic thinking that reflected their different political foundations. Roman tactics, developed for conquering and subduing resistant populations, emphasized overwhelming force applied at decisive points to achieve rapid and complete victory. Commonwealth military doctrine, evolved from the Confederation's federal structure, focused on coordinated defense that could absorb initial attacks while mobilizing superior resources for sustained resistance. The Battle of the Sequana, fought along the banks of what Romans called the Seine River, became the first major test of these competing military philosophies. Roman forces, advancing in traditional formation behind their legendary discipline and engineering capabilities, encountered Celtic Commonwealth defenders who employed tactics that combined traditional guerrilla warfare with sophisticated logistical support provided through Confederation supply networks. The result was a type of warfare that neither side had previously experienced. Roman attempts to achieve decisive victory through concentrated assault, founded against defensive systems that could retreat when pressed while maintaining communication and supply connections with supporting forces throughout the Commonwealth network. Celtic warriors, traditionally limited to seasonal campaigns by the agricultural demands of their communities, found themselves able to sustain resistance indefinitely through Confederation support systems. The strategic implications of this military stalemate forced both empires to reconsider their fundamental approaches to territorial expansion. Rome, accustomed to rapid conquest followed by administrative consolidation, found itself committed to an extended campaign that consumed enormous resources while producing minimal territorial gains. The Commonwealth, despite its defensive success, recognized that prolonged military confrontation threatened to undermine the economic prosperity and cultural development that form the foundation of Confederation unity. The resolution of this conflict came through diplomatic innovation rather than military victory. Commonwealth negotiators, drawing on their Confederation's experience with voluntary association and mutual benefit, proposed terms that offered Roman territories access to Asian trade networks in exchange for recognition of Commonwealth sovereignty over European associates. This approach transformed a zero-sum territorial dispute into a positive-sum economic opportunity that both empires could benefit from pursuing. The Treaty of Lutetia, signed in the Celtic settlement that would later become Paris, established principles of inter-imperial relations that had never before been attempted on such a scale. Rather than defining fixed territorial boundaries that would inevitably become sources of future conflict, the treaty created overlapping zones of economic cooperation where both Roman and Commonwealth merchants could operate under mutually agreed commercial codes. This innovative approach to international relations reflected the Commonwealth's fundamental insight that prosperity could be enhanced through cooperation rather than diminished through competition. Roman territories gained access to Asian silk, spices, and manufactured goods, while Commonwealth regions could export their products to Mediterranean markets that had previously been closed to them. The result was an expansion of trade that benefited both empires while reducing the incentives for military conflict. The success of this diplomatic model encouraged its application to other potential conflict zones where expanding empires encountered Commonwealth influence. The Parthian Empire, caught between Roman pressure from the west and Commonwealth expansion from the east, found itself offered partnership opportunities that provided security against Roman encroachment while maintaining Parthian political independence. Similar arrangements were negotiated with the kingdoms of Nubia and Axum in northeastern Africa, where Commonwealth merchants operating through Red Sea trade routes encountered populations that possessed valuable resources but lacked the military strength to resist either Roman or Commonwealth expansion. Rather than competing for control over these territories, both empires found it more profitable to cooperate in their development and protection. These diplomatic successes created a new model of international relations that gradually spread throughout the ancient world. The concept of competitive cooperation, where rival powers pursued their interests through mutually beneficial arrangements rather than military confrontation, began to replace the traditional assumption that one empire's gain necessarily required another's loss. The intellectual foundations for this transformation in international thinking emerged from the Commonwealth's educational institutions, where scholars from across the Confederation worked to understand the principles that had made their own political experiment successful. The Academy of Universal Studies, established in the former Mauryan capital of Pataliputra, became a center for research into comparative government, international law, and economic theory that attracted students from throughout the known world. Roman scholars, initially skeptical of Commonwealth political theories, found themselves increasingly impressed by the practical results that Confederation methods achieved. The prosperity of Commonwealth territories, the stability of Confederation institutions, and the voluntary loyalty that regional populations displayed toward the central government presented challenges to Roman assumptions about the relationship between authority and obedience. Greek philosophers, heirs to classical traditions of political analysis, began to develop new theoretical frameworks that could account for the Commonwealth's success while addressing the limitations that classical political theory had identified in federal systems. The concept of distributed sovereignty, where political authority was shared among multiple levels of government according to functional rather than territorial criteria, emerged from these theoretical investigations. These intellectual developments had practical implications that extended far beyond academic debates. Roman provincial administrators, exposed to Commonwealth governance methods through border interactions and commercial relationships, began to experiment with confederation techniques in their own territories. The results, while limited by the constraints of Roman legal and political traditions, demonstrated that even established imperial systems could benefit from Commonwealth innovations. The most significant of these experiments occurred in the Roman province of Asia, where Governor Marcus Tullius Cicero implemented administrative reforms that granted greater autonomy to local communities while maintaining Roman legal authority over interregional disputes and external relations. This hybrid system, combining Roman legal traditions with Commonwealth federal principles, produced improvements in economic development and political stability that attracted attention throughout the empire. Similar experiments were conducted in other Roman provinces, with varying degrees of success depending on local conditions and the flexibility of individual administrators. The cumulative effect of these innovations was to create within the Roman Empire a network of provinces that operated according to principles derived from Commonwealth experience, even while maintaining formal loyalty to Roman authority. This internal transformation of Roman governance had profound implications for the relationship between the two empires. As Roman territories adopted Commonwealth-inspired administrative methods, the practical differences between Roman and Commonwealth systems began to diminish. Populations in border regions found that they could move between Roman and Commonwealth territories with minimal disruption to their economic activities or cultural practices. The emergence of this trans-imperial cultural and economic zone created new possibilities for cooperation that transcended traditional political boundaries. Merchants operating in these regions developed commercial practices that drew on both Roman legal traditions and Commonwealth trade codes. Scholars and artists moved freely between Roman and Commonwealth institutions, creating intellectual and cultural syntheses that enriched both civilizations. The religious implications of this cultural integration were particularly significant. The Commonwealth's approach to religious diversity, based on finding common ethical principles while celebrating doctrinal differences, proved attractive to populations within Roman territories, where traditional religious practices were increasingly challenged by new spiritual movements from the East. Christianity, emerging within the Roman Empire during this period of cultural transformation, found itself influenced by Commonwealth approaches to religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue. Early Christian communities, particularly in Eastern Roman territories with extensive Commonwealth contact, developed theological and organizational practices that reflected Confederation principles of unity through diversity. The spread of Buddhist ideas through Commonwealth trade networks similarly influenced religious development throughout the Roman world. Buddhist concepts of compassion, non-violence, and the interconnectedness of all life found receptive audiences among populations weary of the violence and exploitation that characterized traditional imperial systems. These religious innovations contributed to a broader transformation in cultural values that gradually reshaped both empires. The Commonwealth's emphasis on voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit began to challenge Roman assumptions about the necessity of hierarchy and domination. Roman concepts of legal equality and individual rights influenced Commonwealth thinking about the relationship between confederation authority and personal freedom. The synthesis of these cultural and political traditions created new forms of social organization that transcended the limitations of both imperial and federal systems. Communities throughout the trans-imperial zone began to experiment with governance methods that combined the efficiency of centralized administration with the flexibility of local autonomy. These innovations in local governance provided models that both empires could adapt to their own needs and circumstances. The Commonwealth's federal structure incorporated lessons learned from Roman administrative efficiency, while Roman provincial systems adopted confederation approaches to managing cultural diversity and regional autonomy. The result was a gradual convergence of imperial systems that maintained their distinct identities, while sharing increasingly similar approaches to governance, economics, and cultural development. This convergence created the foundation for even more ambitious experiments in inter-imperial cooperation that would reshape the ancient world in ways that neither empire's founders could have anticipated. As our exploration of this alternate history continues, we begin to see how the Commonwealth's original vision of Asian unity had evolved into something far grander, a transformation of the entire concept of political organization that offered hope for resolving the conflicts and contradictions that had plagued human societies since the emergence of complex civilizations. The question that dominated thinking in both empires was whether this convergence could continue without losing the distinctive strengths that each system had developed. Could Roman efficiency be preserved while adopting Commonwealth tolerance? Could Commonwealth flexibility survive the introduction of Roman legal precision? The answers to these questions would determine not just the fate of two empires, but the entire trajectory of human political development. In the imperial councils of Rome and the confederation assemblies of the Commonwealth, leaders grappled with possibilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of political authority and social organization. The dream of unity that had inspired the Commonwealth's founders was expanding beyond Asia, beyond any single empire, toward a vision of human cooperation that encompassed the entire known world. Yet, with this expansion came new challenges that tested the limits of even the most innovative political systems. The question that haunted both empires was whether the principles that had made regional cooperation possible could be scaled up to manage global relationships, or whether the attempt to create truly universal political institutions would exceed the capacity of ancient technology and administrative systems to support. As the sun sets on another day in our imagined world, where the wisdom of ages past guides the dreams of ages yet to come, we drift toward the ultimate questions that any study of alternate history must confront. What possibilities remain forever closed by the choices that were actually made? What lessons from paths not taken might still guide us toward futures we can barely imagine? In the gentle embrace of approaching sleep, let these questions carry you toward rest, knowing that the human capacity for cooperation and creativity that made our imagined Commonwealth possible continues to shape the real world in which we wake each morning. The morning light of our imagined world illuminated a landscape that defied every assumption about the natural limits of human cooperation. As the Commonwealth's influence spread beyond the traditional boundaries of empire and confederation, it encountered peoples and civilizations that challenged the very foundations upon which the Asian experiment had been built. The Scythian horsemen of the northern steppes, the Nubian kingdoms of the Upper Nile, the Celtic druids of the Atlantic shores, each brought their own understanding of power, governance, and the relationship between individual and community. The Commonwealth's response to this diversity revealed the true genius of its evolutionary approach to political organization. Rather than imposing a single model of governance on all member territories, the Confederation developed what its theorists called adaptive federalism, a system that could incorporate radically different political traditions while maintaining the essential principles that held the larger structure together. This adaptability was perhaps most dramatically demonstrated in the Commonwealth's encounter with the maritime peoples of the Western Ocean. Celtic seafarers, following currents and winds that Asian navigators had never explored, brought back reports of lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where entirely different forms of human organization had evolved. These were not the city-states and kingdoms familiar to Mediterranean civilizations, but tribal confederations that governed vast territories through networks of kinship and ritual obligation. The integration of these Atlantic peoples required innovations in Commonwealth governance that stretched the Confederation's institutional framework to its limits. Traditional concepts of territorial sovereignty, already modified by the Commonwealth's federal structure, proved inadequate for dealing with populations whose political identity was based on seasonal migration patterns and ceremonial gatherings rather than fixed settlements and administrative boundaries. The solution emerged through a process of institutional creativity that drew on the deepest philosophical traditions of Commonwealth thinking. If political authority could be shared among different levels of government according to functional criteria, then it could also be shared according to temporal criteria. Seasonal assemblies could exercise certain types of authority during specific periods, while permanent administrative bodies maintained continuity between gatherings. This temporal dimension of Commonwealth federalism opened new possibilities for accommodating peoples whose entire social organization was based on cyclical rather than linear concepts of time and authority. The Celtic seasonal festivals became integrated with Commonwealth administrative calendars, creating governance systems that operated according to both solar cycles and bureaucratic schedules. The intellectual implications of these innovations rippled throughout the Commonwealth's educational and philosophical institutions. The Academy of Universal Studies found itself grappling with questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of political authority, social organization, and human community. If governance could be adapted to accommodate such radically different approaches to time, space, and social relationships, what other possibilities remained unexplored? These theoretical investigations had practical consequences that transformed Commonwealth society in unexpected ways. The integration of cyclical governance concepts encouraged experimentation with new forms of political participation that went beyond the representative assemblies and professional bureaucracies that had characterized earlier phases of Confederation development. Citizens throughout Commonwealth territories began to participate in seasonal councils that addressed specific issues according to natural cycles rather than administrative convenience. Agricultural policy was debated during planting and harvest seasons when farmers could participate without abandoning their fields. Military planning occurred during winter months when soldiers were not engaged in active campaigns. Commercial regulations were reviewed during the trading seasons when merchants could bring their practical experience to bear on policy decisions. This cyclical approach to governance created new forms of civic engagement that strengthened the bonds between citizens and Confederation institutions. Rather than viewing government as a distant bureaucracy that operated according to its own mysterious logic, Commonwealth citizens began to see political participation as a natural extension of their seasonal activities and community responsibilities. The cultural implications of this transformation were equally profound. The Commonwealth's approach to governance had always emphasized the preservation of local traditions within the larger Confederation framework. The integration of cyclical political concepts encouraged even deeper exploration of the relationship between cultural identity and political authority. Regional festivals and ceremonies previously viewed as quaint local customs with little relevance to serious political affairs began to be understood as sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations. Commonwealth scholars studying these traditions discovered governance principles that complemented and enriched the Confederation's formal institutional structures. The religious dimension of this cultural integration reflected the Commonwealth's long-standing commitment to spiritual diversity. The seasonal ceremonies of Celtic peoples, the astronomical observations of Central Asian nomads, the harvest festivals of Southeast Asian agriculturalists, all were recognized as valid expressions of the same fundamental human need to understand the relationship between individual existence and cosmic order. This spiritual synthesis created new forms of interfaith dialogue that went beyond the theological debates that had characterized earlier Commonwealth approaches to religious diversity. Rather than focusing on doctrinal differences, these discussions explored the common experiential foundations that underlay different spiritual traditions. The result was a deepening of religious understanding that enriched all traditions while threatening none. The economic implications of Commonwealth expansion into Atlantic territories were equally transformative. The Confederation's trade networks, already spanning from the Pacific Islands to the Mediterranean shores, suddenly gained access to resources and markets that had never before been integrated into Asian commercial systems. The wealth that flowed from these new trade relationships supported technological innovations that accelerated the pace of Commonwealth development. Atlantic knowledge of ocean navigation combined with Asian astronomical observations to produce new methods of long-distance sea travel that opened previously unimaginable possibilities for exploration and commerce. The development of improved shipbuilding techniques, drawing on Celtic expertise with Atlantic conditions and Asian experience with monsoon navigation, produced vessels capable of oceanic voyages that dwarfed anything previously attempted. These ships, crewed by sailors from across the Commonwealth's maritime territories, began to explore sea routes that connected distant continents in ways that had never before been possible. The discovery of southern sea routes that bypassed the traditional Mediterranean trade networks created new economic opportunities that further enhanced Commonwealth prosperity, while reducing dependence on Roman commercial cooperation. African kingdoms that had previously been accessible only through Egyptian intermediaries could now be reached directly through Commonwealth shipping, opening markets for Asian goods while providing new sources of African products that had never before been available in Confederation territories. These expanded trade networks supported population growth throughout Commonwealth territories that provided the human resources necessary for even more ambitious projects of exploration and development. The Confederation's educational institutions, supplied with students from an ever-widening range of cultural backgrounds, became centers of intellectual innovation that advanced human knowledge in every field of study. The mathematical advances that emerged from this intellectual ferment built upon the earlier achievements of Commonwealth scholars, while incorporating new perspectives from recently integrated cultures. Celtic expertise in geometric patterns, developed through centuries of artistic and ceremonial traditions, combined with Asian numerical systems and African astronomical observations to produce mathematical insights that revolutionized engineering and navigation. These theoretical advances had immediate practical applications in the Commonwealth's ongoing infrastructure projects. The canal systems that connected Asia's major watersheds were extended through new engineering techniques that could overcome geographical obstacles previously considered insurmountable. Mountain ranges that had blocked transportation routes for millennia were pierced by tunnels whose construction required mathematical precision that had never before been achieved. The road networks that connected Commonwealth territories were expanded and improved using construction methods that drew on engineering traditions from across the Confederation. Roman techniques for building all-weather highways, combined with Celtic knowledge of working with difficult terrain and Asian expertise in bridging major rivers to create transportation systems that functioned effectively in every climate and geographical condition. But perhaps the most significant infrastructure achievement was the development of communication systems that could maintain contact across the Commonwealth's vast distances with unprecedented speed and reliability. The optical telegraph networks that had connected Asian territories were extended through new technologies that could function in the cloudy Atlantic climates and dense African forests that had previously made such systems impractical. These communication advances created new possibilities for coordination and cooperation that transformed the nature of Commonwealth governance. Regional assemblies could consult with each other on policy issues that affected multiple territories, while the Central Confederation government could respond to local crises with a speed that had never before been possible in large-scale political systems. The military implications of these communication and transportation improvements were equally significant. Commonwealth forces could be coordinated across continental distances with tactical precision that gave the Confederation decisive advantages over any potential opponents. More importantly, the improved logistics capabilities meant that Commonwealth military power could be projected to any threatened region without the long delays that had previously made distant campaigns impractical. These military capabilities were tested when the Commonwealth encountered its first serious external threat since the resolution of the Roman conflict. The expansion of Commonwealth influence into African territories brought the Confederation into contact with kingdoms and tribal confederations that possessed military traditions and geographical advantages that nullified many of the technological superiorities that had made earlier Commonwealth expansion successful. The kingdoms of Nubia and Aksum, controlling the vital trade routes between the Red Sea and the African interior, possessed cavalry forces that could match anything the Commonwealth could field, while operating in desert conditions that challenged Asian military traditions. More significantly, these African powers had developed diplomatic relationships with other regional kingdoms that could potentially create anti-Commonwealth coalitions spanning the entire continent. The Commonwealth's response to this challenge demonstrated the maturity that the Confederation's political institutions had achieved through generations of managing diversity and complexity. Rather than seeking military solutions to what was fundamentally a political problem, Commonwealth diplomats approached African kingdoms with proposals for partnership that respected their sovereignty while offering access to Asian trade networks and technological innovations. This diplomatic approach succeeded beyond the most optimistic expectations of Commonwealth negotiators. African kingdoms, impressed by the prosperity of Commonwealth territories and attracted by the Confederation's reputation for respecting local traditions, chose voluntary association over military resistance. The result was an expansion of Commonwealth influence that brought the Confederation's borders to the Atlantic shores of Western Africa. The integration of African territories created new challenges and opportunities that tested every aspect of Commonwealth governance. African political traditions, based on divine kingship and age-grade societies, required adaptations in Confederation structures that were even more complex than those that had been necessary for integrating Celtic and Germanic peoples. The solution emerged through innovations in Commonwealth federalism that created new categories of membership that preserved essential African political traditions while providing pathways for gradual integration into Confederation institutions. African kingdoms maintained their traditional structures while participating in Commonwealth economic networks and diplomatic councils. This flexible approach to political integration created precedents that would prove crucial as Commonwealth influence continued to expand. The Confederation had demonstrated that it could accommodate virtually any form of political organization while maintaining the essential principles that held the larger structure together. This adaptability would prove essential as Commonwealth explorers and merchants encountered even more diverse forms of human organization in the territories that lay beyond the African horizon. The success of African integration encouraged even more ambitious exploration projects that pushed the boundaries of the known world in every direction. Commonwealth expeditions reached the ice-locked northern shores of Europe, where they encountered peoples who had adapted to Arctic conditions in ways that challenged every assumption about the limits of human habitation. In the south, Commonwealth navigators following African coastal routes discovered sea passages that led to lands whose very existence had been unknown to Mediterranean civilizations. These southern territories, with their unique climates and unfamiliar flora and fauna, offered resources and opportunities that could support further expansion of Commonwealth trade networks and territorial influence. The wealth generated by these discoveries supported technological innovations that continued to advance Commonwealth capabilities in every field of human endeavor. The Confederation's shipbuilding industry produced vessels capable of polar navigation, while its agricultural specialists developed techniques for cultivating Asian crops in African and European climates. But perhaps the most significant development was cultural rather than technological. The Commonwealth's approach to managing diversity had created a civilization that thrived on difference rather than being threatened by it. Each new culture encountered and integrated into the Confederation framework contributed something unique that enriched the entire system while preserving its own distinctive identity. This cultural synthesis produced artistic and intellectual achievements that surpassed anything that individual cultures could have accomplished in isolation. Epic poems that incorporated narrative traditions from across the known world, architectural styles that blended techniques from every Commonwealth territory, philosophical treatises that synthesized wisdom traditions from dozens of different cultures, all emerged from the creative ferment that Commonwealth integration had made possible. The educational institutions that supported this cultural flowering became centers of learning that attracted students from throughout the ancient world. The University of Taxila, the Academy of Universal Studies in Pataliputra, the Maritime Institute of Kalinga, all became destinations for scholars seeking to understand the principles that had made Commonwealth success possible. These institutions produced graduates who carried Commonwealth ideas and methods back to their home territories, creating networks of influence that extended far beyond the Confederation's formal political boundaries. Roman administrators, Parthian merchants, Germanic tribal leaders all found themselves applying Commonwealth principles to the challenges they faced in their own societies. The result was a gradual transformation of political thinking throughout the ancient world that went far beyond the immediate influence of Commonwealth expansion. The idea that governance could be based on voluntary cooperation rather than coercive domination began to challenge traditional assumptions about political authority in societies that had never had direct contact with Commonwealth territories. This intellectual influence was perhaps the Commonwealth's most significant achievement. By demonstrating that large-scale political organization could function effectively while preserving diversity and respecting local autonomy, the Confederation had created new possibilities for human social organization that would continue to inspire political innovation long after the Commonwealth itself had passed into history. As our exploration of this alternate timeline draws toward its close, we find ourselves contemplating a world transformed by the vision of unity through diversity that had inspired the Commonwealth's founders. The experiment that had begun with Ashoka's decision to transform the Mauryan Empire into something unprecedented in human history had evolved into a global transformation that touched every aspect of human civilization. The political innovations, technological advances, cultural syntheses, and spiritual insights that had emerged from Commonwealth experience offered humanity new ways of organizing society that transcended the limitations of traditional imperial systems. The Confederation had demonstrated that cooperation could be more effective than conquest, that diversity could strengthen rather than weaken large-scale political organization, and that voluntary association could create bonds stronger than those forged by military domination. Yet even as we marvel at these achievements, we must acknowledge that no human institution, however well designed or successfully implemented, can solve all the challenges that face human societies. The Commonwealth, for all its innovations and successes, remained subject to the same forces of change, conflict, and entropy that have shaped human history throughout the ages. The question that haunts our alternate history is whether the principles that made Commonwealth success possible could survive the inevitable challenges that would test every aspect of Confederation institutions. Could voluntary cooperation withstand the pressures of resource scarcity, environmental change, and cultural conflict? Could federal structures maintain their flexibility while preserving essential unity? Could the spirit of tolerance and mutual respect that had made Commonwealth integration possible survive the temptations of power and the fears that accompany uncertainty? These questions remind us that even in our imagined world of perfect cooperation and voluntary association, the human condition retains its essential complexity and contradiction. The achievements we have explored tonight represent possibilities rather than certainties, dreams rather than destinies. Yet they are possibilities that remain within the realm of human capability. Dreams that continue to inspire those who seek to create better forms of human organization. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of these speculations about what might have been, let yourself imagine how different our world might be if the wisdom that guided our imaginary Commonwealth could inform the choices we make in our own time. The challenges we face today, the divisions that separate us, the conflicts that waste our resources and diminish our humanity, all might find resolution through approaches inspired by the spirit of cooperation and respect that made Commonwealth success possible. In the quiet darkness that surrounds you now, the echoes of our alternate history remind us that human beings possess remarkable capacities for creativity, cooperation, and adaptation that we have barely begun to explore. The future remains unwritten, and the dreams of unity and prosperity that animated our imagined Commonwealth remain within reach for those who dare to believe that humanity's greatest achievements lie not in its past, but in the possibilities that await discovery in the years to come. The morning sun that rises over our Commonwealth territories casts its light upon a truth that historians in our timeline would struggle to comprehend. For in this world where ancient India unified Asia, the very concept of historical inevitability has been shattered. The rise and fall of empires, the clash of civilizations, the endless cycle of conquest and collapse that defined our reality, replaced by something unprecedented in human experience, a form of governance that grew stronger through diversity rather than weaker, that expanded through invitation rather than invasion. Yet as we witness the Commonwealth's influence spreading to the furthest reaches of the known world, we must confront the ultimate question that haunts all alternate histories. What price was paid for this unprecedented success? What forces, dormant in our timeline, were awakened by humanity's premature unity? For even in this world of cooperation and voluntary association, the fundamental laws that govern human nature remained unchanged. The Commonwealth's greatest challenge came not from external enemies or internal rebellions, but from its own success. The prosperity that flowed through Confederation trade networks created wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything previously imagined. Cities throughout Commonwealth territories grew beyond the capacity of their agricultural hinterlands to support them. The population explosion that accompanied political stability and economic prosperity strained resources that had seemed inexhaustible during the Confederation's earlier phases of development. In the great port cities of Kalinga, where ships from 3 continents docked daily, the streets overflowed with merchants, artisans, and laborers, drawn by opportunities that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. But this concentration of humanity created new forms of social tension that the Commonwealth's political institutions had never been designed to address. The voluntary cooperation that bound regional governments together proved less effective at managing the daily conflicts that arose when millions of people from radically different cultural backgrounds were forced to share limited urban space. The environmental consequences of Commonwealth prosperity became apparent as the Confederation entered its 4th century of existence. The vast transportation networks that connected Asian watersheds began to alter river systems in ways that affected agricultural productivity across entire regions. The mining operations that supplied metals for Commonwealth industry scarred landscapes that had remained unchanged for millennia. The forests that provided timber for the Confederation's endless construction projects began to disappear at rates that alarmed even contemporary observers. These environmental pressures created the first serious ideological divisions within Commonwealth society since the Confederation's founding. A new generation of philosophers and administrators, educated in Commonwealth institutions, but witnessing the unintended consequences of Confederation policies, began to question whether unlimited growth and expansion were compatible with the harmony and balance that had originally inspired the Asian experiment. This intellectual movement, centered in the ancient university city of Taxila, developed theories of sustainable development that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human prosperity and natural resources. These thinkers argued that the Commonwealth's success had been built upon the exploitation of resources that could not be renewed, and that continued expansion would inevitably lead to environmental collapse that would destroy the Confederation's foundations. The political implications of these environmental concerns created the first serious challenge to Commonwealth unity since the Northern Alliance Rebellion centuries earlier. Regional governments whose economies depended on resource extraction found themselves at odds with territories that had already experienced the negative consequences of intensive development. The federal structure that had once facilitated cooperation now became a forum for conflicts that threatened to tear the Confederation apart. The crisis deepened when astronomical observations conducted at Commonwealth observatories began to detect celestial phenomena that suggested fundamental changes in the cosmic order that governed earthly affairs. The star charts that had guided Confederation policies for centuries suddenly showed patterns that defied traditional understanding. Eclipses occurred at unexpected times. Planetary movements deviated from predicted paths, and new celestial objects appeared in regions of the sky that should have been empty. These astronomical anomalies coincided with environmental changes that seemed to confirm the predictions of those who had warned about the consequences of unlimited expansion. Harvest failures occurred in regions that had been consistently productive for generations. Rivers changed their courses without apparent cause. Weather patterns shifted in ways that disrupted agricultural cycles throughout Commonwealth territories. The Confederation's response to these challenges revealed both the strengths and limitations of the political system that had made Asian unity possible. The federal structure that had accommodated such remarkable diversity of cultures and governance traditions proved flexible enough to address environmental concerns through coordinated policy changes across all member territories. New institutions were created to monitor resource use and coordinate conservation efforts on a continental scale. Yet the same diversity that had been the Commonwealth's greatest strength also made it difficult to achieve the unanimous agreement that effective environmental action required. Regional governments whose populations depended on industries that contributed to environmental degradation resisted policies that threatened their economic foundations. The consensus-building processes that had worked effectively when the Confederation was addressing external threats proved inadequate for managing conflicts where there were no clear enemies and no obvious solutions. The intellectual ferment created by these challenges produced the Commonwealth's final great contribution to human civilization: a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between political organization and environmental sustainability that would not be matched in the West for over a millennium. Commonwealth scholars developed theoretical frameworks for analyzing the long-term consequences of human activities that anticipated modern ecological thinking by centuries. These insights led to policy innovations that demonstrated the Commonwealth's remarkable capacity for adaptation and learning. New forms of agriculture that maintained productivity while preserving soil fertility were developed and disseminated throughout Confederation territories. Industrial processes were redesigned to reduce waste and minimize environmental impact. Transportation systems were modified to reduce their effects on natural watersheds and wildlife habitats. But perhaps the most significant innovation was political rather than technological. The Commonwealth developed new forms of democratic participation that gave future generations a voice in contemporary policy decisions. Representative assemblies were expanded to include advocates for unborn citizens whose interests would be affected by current choices. This temporal expansion of political representation created governance systems that could balance immediate needs against long-term consequences in ways that had never before been attempted. These institutional innovations attracted attention from throughout the ancient world, where other civilizations were beginning to confront their own environmental limitations. Roman territories, facing deforestation and soil exhaustion from intensive agricultural exploitation, sent delegations to study Commonwealth conservation methods. Germanic tribes, struggling with the environmental consequences of population growth and territorial expansion, sought Commonwealth expertise in sustainable development. The knowledge that flowed from these exchanges created the foundations for a global transformation that went far beyond the Commonwealth's formal political boundaries. Environmental management techniques developed in Asian territories were adapted for use in European and African conditions. Conservation philosophies that had emerged from Commonwealth political theory influenced policy decisions in kingdoms and tribal confederations throughout the known world. Yet even as the Commonwealth's environmental innovations spread globally, the Confederation itself faced internal challenges that tested the very foundations of its political system. The consensus that had bound diverse territories together for centuries began to fracture under the pressure of difficult choices about resource allocation and development priorities. Regional governments that had willingly accepted Confederation authority when it brought prosperity and security began to question whether continued unity was worth the constraints that environmental protection required. The final crisis came when astronomical observations revealed that the celestial anomalies that had troubled Commonwealth astronomers were not random events, but part of a larger pattern that suggested fundamental changes in the cosmic order. Ancient texts, preserved in monastery libraries throughout the Confederation, spoke of great cycles that governed earthly affairs over periods measured in thousands of years. These texts suggested that the period of harmony and prosperity that had made Commonwealth success possible was drawing to a close, to be followed by an age of upheaval that would test every human institution. The implications of these discoveries divided Commonwealth society in ways that no previous challenge had managed. Those who believed in the accuracy of ancient prophecies argued that the Confederation should prepare for inevitable collapse by decentralizing authority and preserving essential knowledge in forms that could survive political fragmentation. Others insisted that human ingenuity and cooperation could overcome any challenge, and that the Commonwealth's achievements proved that destiny could be shaped by conscious choice rather than cosmic inevitability. This philosophical divide reflected deeper questions about the nature of human progress and the possibility of permanent political solutions to the challenges that had plagued civilization throughout history. The Commonwealth had demonstrated that cooperation could triumph over competition, that diversity could strengthen rather than weaken large-scale political organization, and that voluntary association could create bonds stronger than those forged by conquest. Yet it had also revealed that even the most successful human institutions remained subject to forces beyond their control. As the Confederation entered what historians would later recognize as its final phase, the question that dominated political discourse throughout Commonwealth territories was whether the achievements of the past 4 centuries could be preserved through the challenges that lay ahead. The environmental innovations, political institutions, cultural syntheses, and technological advances that had emerged from the Asian experiment represented humanity's greatest accomplishments in the field of social organization. Yet they also represented a form of human achievement that might be too complex and demanding to survive the inevitable changes that time would bring. The answer to this question would determine not just the fate of the Commonwealth itself, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. For in our alternate timeline, as in our own, the greatest achievements of human cooperation remained vulnerable to the same forces of change, conflict, and entropy that had shaped history since the beginning of recorded time. The dream of permanent unity and prosperity that had inspired the Commonwealth's founders confronted the eternal human challenge of creating institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values and achievements. In the quiet twilight of our imagined world, as the Commonwealth faced its ultimate test, we are reminded that even the most successful alternate histories must confront the fundamental limitations that define the human condition. The possibilities we have explored tonight, the achievements we have celebrated, the innovations we have admired, all remain subject to the same forces that have shaped our own historical experience. Yet they also demonstrate that within those limitations, human creativity and cooperation can achieve results that transform the very nature of what seems possible. As you drift towards sleep, carried by these reflections on what might have been, let the Commonwealth's legacy remind you that the future remains unwritten. The challenges we face in our own time, the divisions that separate us, the conflicts that waste our resources and diminish our humanity, all might find resolution through approaches inspired by the wisdom that guided our imaginary confederation. The human capacity for cooperation, creativity, and adaptation that made Commonwealth success possible continues to exist in our own world, waiting for new generations of visionaries to transform dreams into reality. In the gentle darkness that surrounds you now, the echoes of our alternate history whisper that the greatest achievements of human civilization emerge not from the ambitions of conquerors or the calculations of the powerful, but from the patient work of those who believe that cooperation can triumph over conflict, that diversity can strengthen rather than divide us, and that the future holds possibilities we have barely begun to imagine. The Commonwealth story ends as all human stories must, but its vision of what humanity might accomplish when united by shared purpose rather than divided by competing fears continues to illuminate the path toward a future worthy of our highest aspirations.